Smith have a few minutes. He unfortunately can only stay for about half an hour. So before we take it over to our Permit Sonoma team, I just want to let him introduce himself and kind of explain his role and what his role might be going forward as well with respect to the LCP.
Yeah, thanks very much, Supervisor Hopkins. My name is Andrew Smith. I'm the Ag Commissioner, Sealer Weights and Measures, and it's nice to see so much interest and so much presence here from the ranching community. I know that we're all interested in what this local coastal plan ends up being when it's pushed before the Board of Supervisors, and there's a lot of interaction between Permit Sonoma and the Department of Ag Weights and Measures when it comes to not only implementing this policy, but talking about what it looks like on the ground when it comes to enforcing some of these things. And the Ag Commissioner's Office is mentioned numerous times throughout the local coastal plan, and so we look forward to hearing from everyone in the ag community, as well as interacting with you on your input, and then also working with Permit Sonoma and any follow-up meetings after this, and also meeting directly with Permit Sonoma staff to talk about how our department is featured in the local coastal plan in not just the ag element, but the open space element, and how we can help inform Permit Sonoma when it comes to what some of the enforcement and implementation will look like on the ground. So happy to be here. I'm sorry that I have to go back to the office so soon because we're being audited by CDFA. So that's a fun experience that I wish upon nobody here. But yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for putting this meeting together and for giving me the opportunity to say a few words.
Yeah. And just to put the tone a little bit, I mean, I'm really excited to have an actual roundtable meeting. I know we've got a couple layers of it, but I want to recognize how frustrating it is to be bound by the Brown Act, right? Where you're given 2 minutes to speak your piece on something that could fundamentally change your livelihood. And I also want to express sort of sympathy for your frustration around the fencing regulation in particular, because the last time I was in this building, I was meeting with Permit Sonoma staff, and I had giant highlighters, and sort of notes scrawled, particularly around the fencing regulation, recognizing that wouldn't contain any animal that I have ever taken care of. No livestock would actually be able to be contained by that fencing. And that came actually from Coastal Commission staff, who I don't think have ever raised livestock either. So I'm really excited to hear from all of you today and to get some literal boots on the ground experience that can be shared with Permit Sonoma. And I also know that Permit Sonoma has heard the concerns that were expressed at our previous public meetings and has already come up with some, potential solutions and some responses to that. So we're really looking forward to hopefully what'll just be kind of like a casual roundtable conversation. Don't need to be too formal. Make sure we have an opportunity to hear from everybody. And with that, I'm going to pick it over to actually first I'm going to briefly introduce. This is Tracy Lyons from the 5th District. She is one of our field representatives. She really pulled this all sort of together this morning and trying to handle all the tech details. So you can either grab her or me if you want to kind of provide feedback on the 5th District side of things. And then I will introduce our Director of Permit Sonoma, Kenneth Witt, to introduce his LCP team.
Thank you, Supervisor. Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Kenneth Witt, Director with Permit Sonoma. This is my 10th year with the agency. I'm still a recovering farmer. I know many of you in the room. I farmed with Craig Jacobson down in Lakeville, about 1,000 acres in hay, tomatoes, and a brief stint in vermiculture. Before Supervisor Rabbit said, "You've been complaining about this place for 15 years. Why don't you come tell us what you do differently?" So that's still a work in progress. So I completely understand what it must be like for you all to come through a local coastal program process when you've been farming, operating out here long before the government came along. So we are trying to be sensitive to that tradition and yet respond to the requirements of state law in the coastal zone. So this is a once in generational policy document in the local coastal program. As the supervisor said, we want to make sure that we get this right so that you can continue with your operations. I fully remember the frustrations of the constant monitoring and scheduling and surveys with the local, the state, and the federal governments that farmers and ranchers have to go through every day. So we want to keep it to a minimum while still protecting the resource values that the coastal access that we have to. So we're going to focus on three outstanding issues today. Fencing, operations, and access. And this morning focusing on the first two. And with me this morning are Cecily Condon, who's leads she's the project manager essentially for this, but her day job is also the head of current planning for permits. Plata Diaz, who is the project manager, she's the finisher. Mr. Helfrich is now retired and off on an island somewhere between Scotland and Norway right now. Vern Ball, who's our county counsel, assigned to this project and has great expertise in environmental law and coastal act. And we also have our coastal commissioner from the 5th district here today, Eric Komikshaw.
Planning commissioner.
Sorry. Or planning commissioner.
Give him a promotion.
So I'm gonna hand it over to Cecily to lead the rest of the discussion. We will be just keeping this to, here's what the policy says now, here are the recommendations to date, and then again, we really want to open up and hear from you. Thank you. Thanks, Cecily.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Cecily Condon, as Tennis introduced me. I've been working on this project off and on for the last 7.5 years with the county, varying degrees of involvement, but I'm really happy to be back in much more of a focused role and to have this discussion with you today. So kind of the first things that we're going to go over is just going to set a really brief context of where we're at in the project process, what some of the current policy is, and sort of where we are in that project for finishing out through Board of Supervisors, and also a little bit about what the California Coastal Commission process is, because this is sort of a unique plan in that sense. So here, I know, apologize, not everyone can see the screen real well. All of this information is also, we're happy to make it available to you. But I just wanted to get up the map of the coastal zone here, because it's a pretty narrow strip, up to 3 miles inland or to the first ridge line is as it's defined for us. So I just wanted to give a pretty good discussion visual on the narrow piece of Sonoma County that we're working through these specific policies on today. You will likely hear us refer to sub areas either in this presentation today or this conversation or when we go before the board. So I just wanted to put another visual up to show you that the coastal zone is divided into 10 sub areas, starting from the north, moving south. And this is how it is currently defined in our 2001 LCP. So this has really been since our first local coastal program, the boundaries that were predefined for us. We're not changing those with this new draft. Just so you know, you can figure out what sub area you're in. Again, happy to answer any questions about that. So the document that we're working on right now is the local coastal plan. It is one part of a 3-part program that we have to implement the California Coastal Act here locally. And so the plan itself is pretty similar to the inland general plan as far as being our guiding document for coastal policy. But we also have 2 additional phases that we're going to work on after the local coastal plan gets finished. And those are going to include the coastal zoning code and potential updates to the administrative manual that we currently have. So we do have a 3-part local coastal program. Today's policy discussion is limited to the local coastal plan, but I think a lot of what we're going to want you all to stay engaged on are things that are going to be coming up also as we get started on working on that implementation plan, because the implementation plan is where we have, you know, where we actually define best management practices and what those would look like. The really nitty-gritty details of criteria. That's also where we have our exclusion orders. And so that's where you'll find if an activity is actually able to be excluded from the coastal development permit requirements that would otherwise apply. And so those things are not going away right now while we're working on the plan document. And I recognize that as somebody that's been so in the weeds with this, that it wasn't really clear until I was rereading the policy and realized, if we're not saying we're not otherwise excluded, there's no reason to believe that this is only applying in the case where there is no exclusion. So I recognize that, and that's one of the more sort of just discussion points for us as our lens of change going through this last kind of series of policy issues. So for agricultural fencing in particular, I'm going to hand it over to Claudette.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Claudette, and I'm taking over Gary's role for LCP planner. I am coming in late in the game, but I'm coming in with a neutral perspective, and so I'm open to discussion for some of these policy options. So we'll be discussing agricultural fencing. The LCP did go before the board on April 4th, and originally we came in with the term agricultural enterprise. Since then, we received direction to replace that with agricultural operations, something that's a little bit more consistent with the right to farm, a little bit more in line with the intent of the right to farm. So that this is the proposed language that we will be using. And again, we're open to discussion here. And it's the same way that it's defined in the current right to farm ordinance. So you can always refer to that if you need to look into it a little bit further. We also came in with this policy that allows for more replacement in kind for fencing, as well as installation of new fencing necessary to support an existing ag operation. In green, I know it's hard to see, and again, we can forward over this PowerPoint later on. Prior to this edit, it used to say agricultural enterprise, and we've then, since then, have replaced agricultural enterprise with agricultural operations. As well as kind of expanding this policy to allow for replacement in kind to support that ag operation and installation to support fencing to support existing ag operation. And since reviewing the public comment that we've received on fencing, we've since then kind of modified the language for this policy that had some more detailed information regarding the design and type of fencing. So at that point, we've made it a little bit more general to kind of accommodate different types of ag operations and intensities. And so,
Can you read that?
Yeah, so at this point it says, so it's been the same as what was proposed and taken to the board. But so at this point it says fencing or walls shall be prohibited within the riparian habitat on bluffs except where necessary for public safety, wildfire risk abatement, habitat protection or restoration, or when necessary to support an existing ag enterprise. I do apologize, it should say ag operation, subject to a coastal development permit. So we removed fencing or walls that do not permit the free passage of wildlife shall be prohibited. Wildlife passable fencing should generally be no more than 40 inches tall and no lower than 16 inches from the ground. Wooden rail, mesh, or chain link is preferred over wire fence tops, which are less visible to and more likely to result in wildlife collisions and entanglements. Where wire cannot be avoided, the top two wires. Apologize. It's all gone. That all those details are gone. And so at this point, this is a scenario. So we have a fence in a coastal zone. It's pertinent to a single family dwelling or existing ag operation. It's outside of environmentally sensitive habitat areas that are mapped on our jurisdictional and ESHA maps. It's outside of a non-excludable area and does not obstruct public access ways or public views of the ocean. At that point, we can use exclusion order S and then therefore determine that this ag fencing or this fence would be exempt from a coastal permit. So that's just an example. So what this is really trying to show and what it's trying to say is that if you were to come in and say, I have an existing ag operation, we would like to have this fence on site or expand the fence. At that point, you would come into planning and we would look at where is this site located? Is it located in an environmentally sensitive habitat area that's mapped? And that's something that's mapped through the California Coastal Commission. We don't really have a say in that. So if it's located in ESHA, first we'll look to see if it's in a non-excludable area or if it's in an excludable area. Those are the two main differences, and that's what will impact exactly how we'll move forward either exempting this from a coastal permit and what exclusion orders will apply. So if we can determine that this property is located outside of a non-excludable area, from there we'll try to figure out exactly where it's mapped. If it's mapped in ESHA, then at that point it will require a coastal development permit. If it's located outside of ESHA, at that point we can go through the exclusion orders, which I have also provided on the table here, and we have copies and I can send those over to you all. And we'll have to make those findings in order to determine if this fence would be exempt from a coastal permit.
So I just wanted to be clear that this is the current process and also not something that would be changing. The policy we saw on that last slide is just where not already excluded or exempt from a coastal permit, this policy would apply. And so these exclusion orders are already within our administrative manual and are going to retain their authority as we go through the rest of this process. So some of this policy language is very specific to that, where not excluded. And that just means an exclusion order is something that gets passed through the Coastal Commission. It is not a part of the local coastal plan document, but it goes through the Coastal Commission process. And the Coastal Commission essentially buys off on our jurisdictional right to say, this activity does not require a coastal permit. And that can only apply in certain areas because of the mapping for the appeal jurisdictions with the Coastal Commission. And so again, I just want to reiterate that that is not a thing that is changing. That is both the current process and also what we're going to be looking into going forward. But it is a little bit of an interesting situation because we have two exclusion orders that are really kind of coming into play on this particular issue. One is specific to fencing, and then the other one is in support of agricultural operations. So I just wanted to sort of reiterate that. Claudette, and then Andrew, you had a question?
Just a question. It's pretty open, it seems, with respect to the type and design of the fence. Is there a reason that we haven't preferred to, at minimum, a lawful fence as defined in Food and Ag Code or in County Code Chapter 5?
I do believe that's closer to what we originally had before the Coastal Commission came in and added in all those weird details. But we could look at an option that brings us back towards a definition like that.
And I just want to check in, is everyone comfortable with ESHA and now also the non-excludable area, or do we need to spend a little more time on that? Okay, maybe. Yeah. Okay, because I feel like we are so used to throwing around these acronyms and jargony language, and what that actually means on the ground is sometimes different. So I don't know, maybe we'll just give like a quick overview. You kind of touched briefly on the non-excludable areas and then also ESHA just to provide that baseline.
We have our giant jurisdictional maps if you want us to pull them out of the car.
I mean, that could be helpful. Like if you actually
Yeah.
have physical copies,
Yeah.
then we could, on the break or whatever, like go around and see it. That might actually be really helpful.
And I know that's been brought up as a bit of a concern, is how are the ESHAs, the environmentally sensitive habitat areas, how are they mapped by the Coastal Commission and then adopted as draft form by the county as part of the local coastal plan? Because ultimately those maps don't get approved until the board approves them as part of a local coastal plan, and then they essentially get ratified by the Coastal Commission. So I think it for everyone's edification, it would be good to know how those maps are drafted, how the Coastal Commission drafts those maps, because if it's going to be incumbent upon a landowner to work with a biologist to demonstrate that they're not going to impact an ESHA to build a fence, well, who drew those maps in the first place?
So we that's sort of a two-part answer, because there's kind of some separate issues related to environmentally sensitive habitat areas. So the county is actually the one responsible for drafting the maps. However, the policy language in our local coastal plan is actually it's a criterion-based definition rather than the maps. So the maps are a great visual resource, but the maps themselves aren't actually holding to, this is right here, so it absolutely is ESHA. The maps are just the tool that we use to say, oh, this is right here, we need to take a closer look. right? And so the maps having something marked as environmentally sensitive habitat area alone is not, you know, it's no death sentence to a project or anything like that. It just means that we need to go in and take another look. They were mapped with a lot of support from our own internal biologist team, and also have gone through at least initial review with the California Coastal Commission in their draft form. But there are two areas you'll see on the environmentally sensitive habitat area maps that are sanctuary preservation area and conservation area. And those are the ones that are really more so established by the Coastal Commission. And those are the ones that we already still have in our coastal maps today. All we did for the sanctuary preservation areas and our conservation areas was bring those forward from the 2001 plan. We didn't add to them or make any significant changes to those areas. So again, those particular pieces of the maps are not really changed. It's just hopefully a little bit more, you know, visible and easy to read than our other maps.
The existing environmental maps that are in the county that describe the sanctuary preservation areas are there are fewer locations in the sanctuary preservation, for example, in Willow Creek, that are on these main components. All today, all the varying corridors that are varying corridors on the zone maps were laid onto LCP and ESHA location. So there's a very different, there's a marked increase of ESHA mapped now to code maps. It's environmental maps. By doing that, all the returning corridors, instead of just being like conservation areas, which is what's normally code today, is what we're supposed to follow for how to manage agriculture in the repairing corridor. It's all being turned into sanctuary preservation, it's by definition has that, which then changes what we do compare events. So I think that I'm wondering there's a conflict between Sonoma counties, the definition of our repairing corridors and by that, the definition of coastal asset does not say it has to be perennial or intermittent spring. Per se, that looks like an addition by Sonoma County to the LCP to say all these habitats are ESHA. It's generally a 300 corridor.
Yeah, so I'm gonna need to do a little research on that as far as where the origin of that particular language change was. Because again, it was sort of a visual exercise at the time, based on those criteria that were brought forward by the Coastal Commission staff during our meetings. But also, you know, we're looking specifically at the fencing issue, and there may be additional opportunities to consider a special treatment for fencing and for that type of use also. So there's a kind of two directions that we can look at this issue. And then just to take a step back, I realized one of the things I neglected to say about our conversation here today is that the goal is that we're going to be coming forward to the board in July with policy options that get into a lot of these details and these issues, and we're likely to see a spectrum of policy options on each issue. I would absolutely love planning by consensus to only have one policy option to be recommending, but it's not likely, and I don't think it's realistic. So I just want to say that you know, we're going to be looking at this and taking our notes and coming forward with sort of a spectrum of options here out of this discussion to bring forward to our board in July. And that's part of where we're going to have additional responses sort of to comment and really beef up some of that discussion too. So that's where I could specifically put in a response related to that mapping change, since we aren't really talking about the mapping for ESHA, because this room wouldn't fit everybody if that was on the agenda today, that we would need to be concerned with involving in that type of a decision change. But again, for looking at it with that lens towards supporting agricultural operations, fencing, those otherwise excludable activities, there may be some additional options there. We'll have to look at that.
So I think it'd be really great to get feedback now on striking the language that came from the coastal commission. And sort of what folks think about that with respect to the fencing issue. Andrew, also brought up a point of, do we actually want to provide a little bit more detail that is more reflective of sort of agricultural fencing options that are routinely, provided inland? Is that something of interest, or do we want to just kind of stick with, let's keep it the same and a little bit more vague? What are folks' thoughts?
Good, I can discuss this.
Or maybe this is slightly different, but the existing agricultural operation, I'm a little concerned about the word existing. It's like when people died, are their kids excluded from continuing? That seems like a big red flag to me.
Any response from staff? Because I think that's a really good point and good question. What counts as an existing agricultural operation? And what happens if there is potentially a lapse? I mean, sometimes, right, you have a tough year, right? You might shrink your herd. Does that mean that you can't then expand it, in the future? Question, how do we define existing?
I don't, Cecily?
There isn't a specific definition written out at this time for what is considered existing. And it could, I think replacement in kind, it is a little redundant. So there may be an opportunity to drop the existing, particularly in that first bullet there, because if it's already replacement in kind, it inherently exists. So I think that we can clarify that. And I'm always a happy person when I can strike words from anything.
This feels very existential and meta. Existing, replacing, yeah. Okay, so concerned about that word. Anything else?
I guess, and I think even for the second, we could consider it being existing or proposed. It's not that you can't start a new ag operation on the coast. It's just gonna be, there are, the ag operation, for example, if for some reason you wanted to actually start a vineyard instead, vineyard is the one type of agricultural development in the coastal zone that would require a coastal permit, vineyard and orchard. So those ones would be required to go through a coastal development permit. But for anything else, you could start a new grazing operation, and there wouldn't be any reason for the policy not to apply if we're already looking at new fencing. That's not going to have those impacts.
So here, so I know most people in the room are livestock enterprise operations. And I completely hear what you're saying. We have to make sure that so as director, I always try to put myself in who's implementing this in the field, because they're going to be the person that you may be interacting with. We don't want to get into your books. We don't want to get into your business. It has to be something that I think is blatant, a change as going from a livestock operation to a vineyard. That doesn't take much regulatory oversight to figure that out. I don't want us being in the position of you deciding to go from X number of animals to another number, or one type of livestock to another. That's not why we're here.
Well, and most of it used to be sheep up here until the predators destroyed all the sheep ranches, and everybody pretty much had to go to cows. And there's the guard dog issue, which is a whole lot more trouble to deal with too. And if you're still keeping sheep. And then this fencing thing, it was in the last coastal plan, about the exact same wording that was proposed. And I don't know, it was shot down then, but I don't know why it keeps popping back up again.
No, as long as there's a state commission and as a local, we're always going to be going through this. And that's the reason why the supervisor wants to convene and make sure that at a local level, we've got this clear so we can make sure it doesn't get any tighter than it has to be. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I was concerned here about the permit required in riparian corridor. We have several riparian corridors on the property. And with that, there's a lot of seasonal runoff. And so every winter, those fences will get wiped out as the water comes up. When those fences don't go back in, as soon as the water goes down, we end up with bulls on the beach. And the folks are usually pretty against that. So in an effort to contain that very quickly, Last time I talked to the coastal commission about a permit, they said, come talk to us in 18 months.
Yeah.
So to do something timely in a matter of weeks, that's gonna be a real concern, being to get in there to do that. So I'd like to take a look at that and see, and I appreciate the clarity on the environmental sensitive areas. I don't know, are all riparian corridors this time around part of an environmentally sensitive area? Then that was requiring the permit, or would it be an option to be able to continue to put fence across and make sure that the livestock doesn't get out in those areas?
So now it passes. Yeah, just to say that before we get there, thank you very much for the first example. There's a perfect example of how fixing a fence actually furthers the coastal act policy. So let's take note of that stuff, and then to your question, followed up by Earl.
Yes, sir.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Why and how those areas chosen to be fenced off and protected to start with?
Okay, good. Thank you.
Can we repeat the questions for the?
Yeah, we'll try. Raise your hand if I'm not.
This one was how and why were those areas chosen?
Well, the creeks, we don't have a riparian corridor ordinance in the coastal zone. Despite the fact that we have one inland. And so in going through the process with the coastal commission, the riparian corridors were mapped on these older maps that we have here. And it was at the commission's recommendation to sort of reflect some of that policy we have inland for the additional protection of riparian corridors by mapping those areas.
So,
So
protection from those riparian corridors being protected from livestock?
from being protected, the new question, so for the riparian corridors to be protected from livestock or development, just more generally speaking. So disturbance of the vegetation is some of the concern.
I think along these lines, a lot of the city here thinking, you start having all these requirements and I don't. Just because you own land doesn't mean you have the cash to pay for all this. And it seems like if the government's gonna come in and say, you have to do this and that, they should have some funding to go along with that so we can survive. I mean, most of us have a second job to maintain our lifestyle that the whole county enjoys. And if you start pressing on us like that, we can't afford that. And so I think it's very important that some sort of funding comes along. This came up with a timber thing up on the coast. It's like, you're gonna do this, you can do that. And it's like, well, who's gonna pay for all this?
So one question that I actually have for staff, because I've had conversations with Stephanie Larson, our UCCE director, who was unfortunately not able to be here today. But she has sort of studies that demonstrate that actually flash grazing of riparian corridors is actually beneficial to the riparian corridor. And from personal experience, right, I've seen where if you don't get livestock in, you can often see invasive species, right, come and just take it over, and then it becomes a thicket. And not really good habitat area for other wildlife. And so I'm wondering, like, is there a way to recognize the beneficial impacts of flash grazing in riparian corridors while still, sort of recognizing that it is, this habitat area that you wouldn't be wanting to sort of implement other substantial types of development in? Is there a way to kind of, I guess, finesse it a little bit to sort of, because the other thing is like, I've done a lot of work with the CTS issue, right? If anyone has any property in the Santa Rosa Plain with the California tiger salamander, and they've actually done studies that the one beneficial agricultural use in California tiger salamander habitat is grazing, because the little salamanders like the hoof prints, I guess. And so, so just one, I feel like that's, if there is evidence and sort of studies that show this could be beneficial, is there a way to encourage that while kind of still suppressing other potential development in that area?
You can certainly speak with Stephanie at Ag Extension to get the justification for that. incorporate that into our recommendation. Thank you.
So that is something we can both work through now as far as getting some of that research through. And that is also something where when we are looking forward, because this policy, again, is all based on the current exclusion orders. But when we get into the implementation phase, there may be opportunity for us to get a bit more teeth in some of our exclusion orders to at least try for that. So we can kind of set some policy direction now to see about continuing to go forward on that kind of path. Where we would have, best management practices, things like that really strongly defined so that we're kind of, really mitigating any of that risk to a point where the Coastal Commission may be confident that we wouldn't need a permit at all. Thank you.
I have two quick questions. The first is, has NRCS, RCD, or the FSA been consulted on the fencing policies, in particularly wanting to fence off the vegetation in the riparian zone?
I can't repeat the acronyms, but the question was if they have been consulted in the process.
RCD and
for-
NRCS.
For fencing, I don't believe on specifically the fencing issue. They have been invited, I believe, in our records for information on the plan generally, but we've never drawn their attention specifically to the fencing issue.
I volunteered to text Che, who is the brand new RCD director today. It's his first day on the job. So, definitely.
NRCS might be a better place to start right now, just to get Che a chance to, get his training wheels going, but that would be lovely, because this is what they do, that and vegetation management. So
Beth, are there any standards you're aware of in the RCD that we should flag within?
No, I don't feel comfortable talking with the technical specifics in this. I don't think I'm up to them enough.
Okay.
But if we just bring this up, they can kind of start to flag some of if there are some issues.
NRCS has all the guidelines you need for conserved livestock, for heavy pressure, blood pressure. They'll have.
Thank you.
Can I just, I'm sorry, one thing. The category of exclusion for fences right now, it only says without, there's no public view, obstructed or public access block, and outside of exhibit 1, which is the beaches and the pipes and public trust. It's not excluded by, it's not excluded out of riparian corridors by the current category of exclusion. And the fact that the Coastal Commission adopted those by a 2/3 vote, they had to ascertain that there was no potential to adverse effect to the coastal resources by approving our category of exclusion. So I would say the Coastal Commission has affirmed already that our fences within a riparian corridor are an allowed exemption. I know if those riparian corridors become ESHA, then that's off the table. But right now, as long as the riparian corridors are not mapped as ESHA, those fences are allowed, I'd say.
Hey, there's a comment on all this. Looking at this, they're different than what was on the policy before. It seems like you said it's more going to go to verbal policy or whatever, the written policy, not so much maps. Today, what's to say in 10 years that now that these maps have been established with extra corridors, that's not going to be held with what, held to what's been off or whatever. I mean, it just seems like it's a grab.
Thank you. There. So the comment was related to the mapped ESHA ultimately potentially becoming the sort of guide to what ESHA is rather than the written policy. The written policy related does actually say specifically that the maps are not to be used, as the whole thing. So it would be inconsistent with the policy if staff started taking that approach.
Yeah, but I'm going to say yes, today it's set with the map, but what about 10 years when There's another LCP update.
There's a complicated legal reason why the Coastal Commission is actually pushing to use criteria more than maps across the state. And the criteria idea is beneficial to some, to some and hurts some. Like if you have something that's designated as ESHA and it becomes difficult to do something in there, and it's not really environmentally sensitive, then it requires a huge amendment process to get it into someplace where it can be developed if the map is inaccurate. So the Coastal Commission likes that idea that you can not have to do an amendment in order to do something that's shouldn't, by virtue of the facts, be required. The other side of that is the Coastal Commission doesn't like maps that are, inadequate for what they determine to be ESHA. And they want to have it be based on criteria. So it's kind of a balancing thing, but this is a statewide issue where the Coastal Commission is moving from maps to criteria.
It's frustrating for us as local practitioners because in the non-coastal area, we have geographic information systems that has everything mapped down to property lines. So I hear you. Yes, sir.
I guess I'm trying to back the bus up here a little bit, but the fencing, what's driving the need to change? I thought in the county was bad for standard agricultural fencing. But I'm trying to give us some language to some about the fencing, because it seems so basic to me. It's not obvious. So why are we a lot of energy going into this to get something stuck to the wall and then documents? Force ranchers to, go into permit fencing, people change their fencing all the time. The desires of potential grazing, different reasons, but to have to get a permit to change your fence. So go along to them.
So,
Opinion is obvious. I get that.
so this change related to this policy, the comment was related to, why have so much discussion around fencing rather than keeping it sort of maybe the silent practice or whatever you would call it that maybe is happening now. But this was specifically flagged as an issue when we did an early reviews of our draft with the California Coastal Commission staff, with our district staff. They are the ones that had initially really expanded on sort of that nitty criterion for the fences also. And so, we're now in a position where we're gonna push back on that change as one of the policy options that would be recommended to be brought forward. As far as having no regulation on fences, I don't know that that's something that outside of our categorical exclusion, we would be able to do, because that exclusion already exists. And the idea was to create a policy for when that's not applicable. And that was the direction that the commission took it. That may still be an option to figure out, but I think the hope would be to get additional clarity out of the situation. Just from a regulatory standpoint, this is going to be implemented over another 20 years, most likely.
And one thing that I want to mention, and the reason that our county staff works so closely with the Coastal Commission staff, right, is that ultimately, we can pass a version at the Board of Supervisors and the Coastal Commission can override it. And so if the staff is very strongly opposed to the draft that we're bringing forward, right, they're not going to recommend that their commissioners support it. And so, there will be a conversation to be had, and I hope that you all stay engaged in the process. When it goes to the Coastal Commission, because it's possible that if we push back on this, right, that we might get pushback when it gets to the Coastal Commission itself. And they're the ones who have the ultimate authority to make alterations and amendments.
I got a question. Let me make sure I understand this, because the question was, what's driving the need for the change of the fencing? I don't think you actually answered the question. I think what you said was Coastal Commission said so. Is that the answer?
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm taking some notes here. I think that's the 6th time I've heard this. That it's the Coastal Commission fault. I heard that at the Board of Supervisors meeting last month. It sounds like, it's really easy to blame the people who are in the room. So what I'd like to know is who at the Coastal Commission is telling you to make this changes, because we're all here. We're the ones who showed up. Where are they? Who's working you to make these changes without an actual goal? You can't even state the goal of the plan. If you're saying the coastal commission's fault, I want to know who it is so that we can bring it up with that. So who is it?
I actually don't, my most recent contact that went through the most recent draft is no longer with the coastal commission. But we,
Is that it?
Yeah.
Timberland is no longer with it. They're saying most of this maybe came from the money here and there. So far, that's so far the answer. Anybody else?
yeah, there is also, Julia Mc, I can never pronounce her last name. We'll get you the contact information. Her name is Julia. We can,
Work in San Francisco aren't dictating the plans for the people who work in Sonoma County.
And we appreciate it. That's one of the reasons why we're having this meeting. And your input is going to be valuable. I think we've learned from some of you and what we can get from the ag commissioner to provide a better justification for why there shouldn't be any additional regulation when it comes to fencing.
Yeah, and I'd also like to see the people from Permits Sonoma maybe having the skin in the game. You know, it's really easy to just back out and say, oh, it's the code commission. So where are you in the process?
They're right here in this room.
We're right here getting information directly. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We'll expect to see that, a little bit of pushback when we bring this.
Well, and during the certification process and during that hearing too, I mean, that's opportunity for you to also be there and voice your concerns. And I mean, we'll be there, you know, presenting and hoping that we certify the document that we're presenting before them with the edits that we're, you know, hearing today. And if you have ideas for revisions to the policies that have been drafted, I mean, that's what we're looking for. It's like, do you have language that we can take to the coastal commission? And if you do, I mean, we can accept all the comments, but if you have language that you can provide us so that we can include that, or at least look at it, so that we have something to reference and really hear you out, I think that would be really helpful too. So, you know, we keep receiving comments and I think it's been really helpful and just kind of learning more about what you guys need, but we also need recommendations. Like, what are some revisions to the language that's there that you can propose and something that we can actually take? Because, you know,
And we've heard some of that this morning.
Yeah.
And I assure you, when we've had other significant issues like fees to be imposed at beaches along the coast, I am there personally advocating for Sonoma County's interest. I know the supervisor will be as well, before their staff and before their commission. So we'll have skin.
I would also say that we all collectively have an opportunity to also approach commissioners individually. There was a huge scandal over ex parte communication some number of years ago, and so some California coastal commissioners no longer accept ex parte communications, but some do. And so you can reach out to the commissioners who do to sort of make your case, right, in advance of the hearing, because as we all know, again, back to the Brown Act, right, you've got your 2 minutes and it's, you know, very difficult to explain everything, but we could also try to have, you know, a series of meetings, you know, via Zoom or in person with those commissioners that do accept ex parte communications.
I have a second point that I wanted to make on the, it's ag fencing, it's the corridor, it's 100 feet and 200 feet. And you take, there is some prime agricultural land in grazing, and you take 200 feet away, you know, at the river edge, that's a big taking. It's not even practical or economically feasible, or even enhances the habitat. It's just kind of a taking, and you're really gonna enforce something like that. And then on the steeper ground, if you're gonna, this 100-foot setback, I mean, a lot of times if the livestock is moving along the slope, if you're forcing them to go up and downhill all the time to stay away from this fencing, you're just causing more erosion. You know, it's probably more, kind of reminds me of the county we don't want to ditch the road, we just lose a couple shovelfuls of dirt into the property, and then we lose 10,000 yards because they didn't take care of the road. Same thing. So, I'm really concerned about the setback thing, and I don't know if that's coming down from the state or the county idea, but that really needs to be looked at.
Well, as always, Mr. Mann, appreciate your perspective, and I think we've had some ideas from Ms. Lee a little earlier in the morning about how we might be able to use the prior practice as a way of defending how we roll out anything related to this.
And if you go by the 200 feet, a lot of times it's on the other side of the road.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah. Gotcha. Yes. Here in front and then this.
Okay, well, to follow on your question, we do appreciate your striking the strange language around fencing. And I hope that we can continue this conversation so that if that does crop up again in the future, it seems like you're saying this will just continue to cycle and we need to stay engaged. Like maybe we could establish channels through Beth, through just let us know how to go about this, because if you need to be advocating against the coastal commission for sort of continued accumulation of this kind of language, we need to expect and work with that, I guess. So.
Yep. We will do so. Ms. Lee and then the first one.
Point that, thank you. I think we've been privy to some of the communications the coastal commission had, we intercommission regarding the fence violations on Golden Valley Road. And they were very specifically, like Dan Carl, for example, said it doesn't really matter much what the local county has in their plan. It matters what's in the categorical exclusion order. It matters what's in the coastal act. And they, I was surprised to read that. But verbatim, I can send you the email. They're not, they don't care as much about the gray zone or what's written in policy. They care about what's in their act and what's in our exclusion order.
And the outcome of all that was pressing us through code enforcement to do something. And when I looked at looked at state rules that you just mentioned in our local, we determined that there was not a violation and closed it out. In all the years I've been doing this, there is always that tension between the state and the local. And when it comes to enforcement, we will follow the law. Yes, ma'am.
Just letting everybody know the wildlife friendly fencing that you have designed will not keep fighting wolves away from each other or sheep or goats going underneath with the barbless wire. So as for the record, it's just not a good strong fencing to keep livestock separated or to have liability if your livestock get out on the road. So just letting you all know that. Livestock fencing needs to be appropriate for the type of livestock that it protects and.
That's where you end up with bulls on the beach.
Yeah. My folks wouldn't even see that as a fence, it wouldn't even register.
Yeah, so I'd like to make a recommendation. I appreciate your asking for recommendations. Ultimately, I think I can speak for a lot of people in the room that we just want to leave it the way it is, but we have to recognize that there's a road that has to get navigated here, right? As we're moving forward, I'd like to recommend that wherever possible, anything that needs to go into effect goes in through policy and not through permits. Mr. Mann has brought up the cost of the permitting.
Yeah.
A little bit ago, I talked about the timing of the permitting. But the third thing, which is probably my biggest concern of all about the permitting process, is the coastal commission's leverage to get easements as a concession for a permit approval.
Yeah.
They've established this. It went to the Supreme Court years ago, right? They still do it. They still do it. They just listed in February that majority of their easements that they've received over the last 3 years are through concessional consideration. So at the local level, if we need to put something in place, one, let's put it in policy so everybody knows what's wrong. We can look it up, we can know what we have to do, or not do, right? And then we can be consistent about it. And then also, let's not give the Coastal Commission that leverage. And really take away our ownership rights. And take those items in order to get our basic essentials the same business.
Yeah, totally hear you. And so just in case, I think it bears repeating. Well, we're gonna fight for fairness and, you know, through the policy document. And then one of the implementation efforts is are these categorical exclusions, which are much clearer. And we'll work with you all in the ag community, we'll work with the ag commissioner. If there's any practical standards we can pull from the non-coastal to further buttress that, we'll do it.
So I sort of feel like maybe this topic is drawing to a close, but before we move on to the next one, I just want to reflect back what you all have said, so we make sure that we didn't miss anything. Sort of the policy not permit, which I think gets to what Director Wick was talking about before, which is, you know, we call them BMPs, but best management practices, right? I felt like I heard consensus around striking the Coastal Commission language, and then not only that, but continuing to have conversations and advocate you know, with the Coastal Commission and sort of express how critical grazing is to, you know, the historic nature of the Sonoma coast, as well as actually maintaining the environment and, you know, depressing invasive species. I also heard, you know, issues come up around timing. You obviously can't wait 18 months to be able to get your fence in, to keep your cattle contained. And then also sort of, is there a way to, even if this is going to be considered ESHA, recognize the beneficial impacts of grazing, that could be a particular use that is appropriate in this area? Is there anything that I am missing from kind of high level? Obviously, we did a little more detail. We got this all recorded, by the way, so we'll be able to go back and review all of the comments and make sure that we covered everything. Does that feel?
In addition to the environmentally sensitive areas, I think that also fire risk is a big thing. With the lack of grazing, we're introducing a huge fire risk, which either takes millions of dollars to mitigate, or it results in unnecessary hazards.
I think that's the huge thing, and was proven years ago on Myers Fire. You know, a piece of ground that was purchased 30 years ago, you know, put it in farmland. Our family grazed it, it was fine. Now it hasn't been grazed for 30 years. And I mean, it burned, and the neighboring ranch where it actually started having been grazed, called 4 years. I mean, it burned it up, but not the, yeah. You lost after that, you lost all kinds of things in that fire. Where if it had been grazed, it would have had a chance to stop. They actually got to stop on a grazed piece of ground.
Yeah, I was there, that was amazing. Good point.
And in addition to that, the vegetation, when it's not managed in a riparian zone, creates wildfire superhighway.
So this actually brings us really, really nicely to the next topic, grazing in Timberland. So this is another one of the main issues that was brought forward in a lot of the comments we received. We also, a few weeks ago, had a similar meeting to this that was focused entirely on vegetation management. So I would expect you all to be looking forward to some new policy options we'll be releasing related to greater support of vegetation management in general, and also the direction that we're going related to that. And then we have here only one slide specific to the issue of grazing in timberland that is really just clarifying that grazing isn't allowed use within RRD timber properties. We're striking the language related to requiring a coastal permit, and the appealability of the use is going to be entirely dependent on all of the other normal criteria that would be related to the appealability. So that staff's proposal on this is just to really make it clear that this is something that you are allowed to do. This is partnered again with some new policy options that we'll be developing, really related to encouraging and promoting vegetation management and streamlining that to the most substantial effect that we can have. So I'm happy to take additional comments.
Yeah, I do some contract fire suppression grazing, and we've also got sheep and cattle, and you get cows in the trees and all those dead limbs that keep going up as the trees get more mature, they really, even if they're not really grazing and eating much, there's an awful lot of knocking dead limbs down, hitting and yeah, it's a big improvement.
We recognize that, and we really, again, we want to be encouraging that both here and also as a tool related to our public safety policies for encouraging that vegetation management.
What about TPC? I tried to find that last couple of days on this website. I couldn't find it. Are you addressing that? Is grazing allowed on TPC?
Yes.
I heard rumors they were gonna remove that.
That was related to this language here that we're striking. So we are striking this language in order to ensure that it will still be allowed in the TPC. If the state does something different about how they manage the TPC contracts, that the actual nitty gritty of that isn't affected by the local coastal plan policy. So I don't know what's happening at the state level related to that. But as far as our policy control, we're doing everything we can to make it extremely clear that it is an allowed use.
Yeah, pretty important.
So I make sure I understood. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Go ahead. Okay, to make sure I understood. I thought I heard you say the source of this language and some of that language around fencing was the Coastal Commission. Did I understand that correctly? And then we are striking it, and then is there some chance that they would insist on adding it back?
There is a chance. I don't think, given the fact that some of the comments on this were prior to the Myers-Grade fire, when we received this language from them, I don't think they're gonna have much personally leverage to strike back, particularly on this issue. So I'm pretty confident as staff that bringing this forward wouldn't be a major issue, but you know, we don't know how they're gonna take it specifically. But I think that this is gonna be more consistent with how language is used throughout the rest of the plan. And that's something that would be likely to garner support.
And what I would recommend is that we really think smartly and quite frankly, try to back the Coastal Commission into a corner. So at our North Coast Vegetation Management meeting, we had a bunch of North Coast fire chiefs. Hellfire was there. I would love to get letters in support from all of our coastal fire chiefs and fire boards, right? In support of this and actually explaining why grazing is a beneficial use. And so that we are actually proudly pro-grazing in Sonoma County because of these environmental benefits, these vegetation management and wildfire risk reduction benefits, right? And so make sure that we're sort of very strongly advocating so that, you know, if Coastal Commission staff were to try to say, hey, we don't like this, that, you know, we've got a lot of support from subject matter experts to kind of counteract that narrative. So I don't see them pushing back, but you don't know. You never have any idea how things are gonna happen at the state level. So I think that we should line up all of our ducks and make sure that we have a lot of support from the community and from subject matter experts.
So we'll be bringing our forester that works for Permit Sonoma along. We'll be bringing Ag Commissioner Smith, Stephanie from Ag Extension. So to the supervisor's point, we have that answer for them in the room right there. Yes, sir.
Not just, I mean, we want to have our ducks road push back on that, but we haven't even been given a reason as to why they're pushing for these changes, right? If we know the reason, then we can attack it. We were just asked for, you know, we have the language, we don't have the language proposed, we don't understand what the goal is. It's not just Coastal Commission coming in and saying, we want this. We have to ask why. And then if there's a reason, then we can maybe address it in a number of different ways. It doesn't sound like you even asked the question why, which is surprising me.
So
We have.
Do you know?
I mean, well, I can give a general response if they want broader environmental protection for impacts they perceive today and what they think might happen tomorrow. That's about as specific as it gets.
very broad. Very broad, and it gives them a lot of power over our properties that we maintain pretty well, if you ask me.
Which I would wholeheartedly agree. And again, that's why we really appreciate comments from you. We're not trying to assume. That's why we're having this forum. We're gonna take your comments back, and it helps us build the counter argument when we know we're gonna have to go to the commission.
I think, let's be honest, they also like greater control from their perspective, right? They like things to be, you know, potentially appealable to the coastal commission. And so, you know, I think that there's always sort of that sense that they're not sure that they're trusting the local jurisdictions, you know, to do what is right. And there are certainly, you know, local jurisdictions in Southern California that have a very different perspective, you know, than we do up here in Sonoma County. And so when they're looking at regulating the whole state, I think that they sort of tend to take a bit of a heavy-handed approach, potentially with experience that they've had not in our jurisdiction, but in other jurisdictions.
There's one explanation in addition, that's kind of technical, but I think you'll get it. So when they use the term principally permitted use, that doesn't mean the same thing as saying it's permitted in the zone. It means when that type of permit can be appealed to the coastal commission if it's issued. So one of the things that the coastal commission has been very strong on is principally permitted use. There can be only one, and they've basically made us walk back, kind of stacking principally permitted uses that can't be appealed to the coastal commission, and we're not going to win a fight on that. But that's not the same as saying you need a permit for everything. It's not the same as saying you need a permit to graze in Timberland, for example, because it principally permitted use is different than a permitted use, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So when they use the term principally permitted use, that means the type of permit that can't be appealed to the coastal commission. And that's not the same as saying this has to get a coastal development permit. Grazing, you know, needs a coastal development permit or something like that. So behind this edit, where they're putting that language in, is this discussion that we've had for about a decade with the coastal commission about how we used to have more than one use in a zone that could not be appealed to the coastal commission. And they're not going to let us take that position that that'll be the case anymore. So that's the reason why there's some of that edit in there. And it's a little bit misleading to think, well, this language, you know, automatically requires permits. It's really all about just what gets appealable, what's appealable to the coastal commission or not. But that's kind of a backstory there, and it goes broadly. The coastal commission will not allow us legally to have more than one use in a zone be, quote, a principally permitted use.
No, really quick, Vern, please talk all the technical language you've got at us. One of the things that I've been so very impressed with once I was enveloped by the agricultural community, they deal with tech language every day. So please, whatever you've got, talk it our way. Linda, the fire fuel mitigation is straight up Jay Valley, so he's ready to deal with this one right off the bat.
I think we have one here and then another.
Yes, I would like to have an example. Could you give us a good example of the principally permitted use, and so that it sticks in my mind, because right now I'm trying to get my arms around what that is.
Actually, I'll defer to Cecily on this, but like, for example, grazing is not the principally permitted use in timber zoning. In order to have that.
But it's a permitted.
But it's a permitted use. So what that means effectively, it is that if you were to have some sort of permit that you were going to get that's not timber, then that could be appealed to the coastal commission.
If you already needed a permit because the activity couldn't be excluded, so like the feed pens, things like that can fall under our categorical exclusion F, I believe it is. Waiting for her to confirm. But in the case you do need a coastal development permit, it changes the ultimate body for appeals. It doesn't change the permit threshold. So if a coastal permit's already required, a coastal permit is still required for a principally permitted use. but it does change the ultimate appeal body, and it is by the coastal act that we have to have a single principally permitted use per district. They've actually found that our current zoning ordinance, which identifies multiple principally permitted uses, is actually not legally sufficient. So that's a particular comment that we would not be able to push back on, as far as being able to say we don't need to have a principally permitted use or a single principally permitted use per district. But again, it does not change the permit threshold. It changes the appealability. So if someone was going to challenge your permit, instead of only being able to challenge it up to the Board of Supervisors, they would be able to also challenge it to the Coastal Commission, but it still has to go through all the other appeal bodies.
Okay, thank you.
Well, two things. One is, the Coastal Act at a first principles level exempts removal or harvesting of native vegetation for agricultural purposes. Section 30106, and it's the first exemption allowed where grazing would not be considered development. So at a first principles level, the Coastal Act, whether it's RRD or timber or LEA, grazing is not development. And so grazing should be exempt and wherever it's existing today as an operation, as far as you push back to the Coastal Commission.
Yes.
And then as you have resource and rural development today, that is considered a principally permitted use, ag is a principally permitted use in RRD, and it's taken out of the LCP. And I just want to confirm that that's, so it is a resource management tool, agriculture, and it would be against all of our academic students to take RRD, take agriculture out of RRD.
So again, it doesn't change that it is a excludable activity. Whether or not it is the principal use, it is still an excludable activity. So you still don't need a coastal permit to graze in Timberland. The reason grazing was removed as a principally permitted use is simply because our current code identifies more than one principally permitted use. We literally had to pick one per district, and that's kind of where we're stuck.
In RRD, it's resource development, and grazing is a resource management tool. So within RRD, we've seen that the agricultural grazing operation is a completely permitted use. Can you guys find that, make that determination?
We can look at how we have those defined and consider that as an option. I would need to look at each of the districts more closely to be able to respond for sure, but that is something that we can explore as an option.
I think another thing we'll do is be pushing the state to acknowledge that livestock grazing is a form of vegetation management that's needed everywhere. I mean, that's certainly our post 2017 reality. I know for many of you it was before, but for those of us not farming every day, we realize it's important. So this is going to be another opportunity for us to push and at the state level, we got things change.
And I would love to see a map of where the RRD is, because I think that, I mean, at least what I've been familiar with in broader West County, not just looking specifically at the coast, there's such a dramatic range in what kinds of vegetation and ecosystem, right? So you have totally open land, and you have very, very forested land, and really those are probably different than what their principally permitted use should be. And yet we kind of have one catch-all category that includes tons of different types of property. Just to give you a small flavor of the conversation that we had on the North Coast, and we've actually helped this constituent and, you know, in partnership with Permits No, we had folks who were fined tens of thousands of dollars for cutting down dead and dying trees directly around their homes, right? Because you literally have to get a CDP to chop down a tree that is threatening your structure, you know, like, so basically, so to comply with state law, which tells you have to have defensible space, you had to get a coastal development permit and wait God knows how many months in order to make your home safe. And we really saw the outcome of, you know, failed vegetation management policies on the North Coast with the thousands of trees that we lost all across our roads, right? Which kept the firefighters busy. I mean, they're still literally clearing stuff on the Sea Ranch and some of the other places. And the places where we had actually secured funding to go and do, you know, the sort of clearing of dead and dying trees from the roadside. That was the only road that stayed open in the North Coast during the storm. So that's kind of just, I want to give a little bit of context for the RRD conversation, how it might be a little bit different on the North Coast compared to sort of the South Coast and the different types of properties. But I agree with you. And given the diversity of property types, it's really silly to have to choose one principally permitted use. Yeah, it's tough.
Well, we have 700 acres that are 2/3 grazing, 1/3 timber that are RRD today that we grazed for 120 years.
There you go.
You know, and today it's because we permit use of this resource tool. And with the proposed LCP, we're taking the big thing pulled out as a piece of permitted use, which, you know, just changes, like making the community and local commission if they don't like that.
But that's where potentially making it an excludable activity, right? That doesn't require.
Yeah, if there's no permit required, there's no appeal.
Right?
Yeah, Joe closes me.
Exact same argument.
Yeah.
So appreciate it.
Yeah, it makes no sense, but we'll do the best that we can within the confines of what they've set us up for.
Has the coastal commission used this theory before in other LCPs to require only one principally permitted use, or are we the guinea pig in this?
This is a common issue that is one of the things that they take up with local coastal programs in general. They are insistent, at least everyone in the North Central Coast District is limited to one principally permitted use as it's defined.
No,
Right,
it's
but it's
a statewide issue, yeah. I mean,
right, I understand. But are we the first one, the Sonoma County, the West County, the first to have this apply?
No, but we can find more specific examples.
More examples would be great, because this strikes me as sort of overtly anti-economic. Like, I can imagine at a state level, they must understand this affects economic viability on these parcels, and they must be proceeding in light of that knowledge.
You're quite kind to put it in that light. I think the supervisor had, you know, it's just, we're faced with an organization with an extraordinary amount of authority that just by its nature tries to tighten things. And our
Tries to
job
run
is
people
to
out of business.
push back and make sure that we can continue to what you've been doing for such a long time.
It seems incredibly obtuse not to recognize all the changes that are happening with the environment in the last 7 to 10 years alone. So these antiquated rules that they're applying at this point, which are subject essentially to very little sort of change, for lack of a better word, seems a little bit ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, what I'm saying is that they've got these rules that they've lined up for a very long period of time that have been so resistant to change. In fact, they're holding on tighter and tighter when the rest of the world is changing around them very quickly, environmentally. Well, what's it going to take for them to realize this?
Well, one
They've
thing
got
that,
too much leverage.
I mean, one thing that I would like to say though, is that there are a number of folks in this room who have really championed, you know, for best available science and best available data and evolving policy as things do change. And so that is actually called out in our current LCP. However, we struggle because like we want to give GIS maps to the Coastal Commission. They don't accept GIS maps right now. You know, I mean, in some ways, like it feels like we're living in this age, but there are, I mean, you know, including Planning Commissioner Koningshofer, who you're standing next to, have really focused on how do we sort of keep things evolving. And I know Jill and Richard, you're part of a lot of those conversations as well. So, you know, it's really important. And we are trying to make sure that we change with changing times.
And the stronger this document is for us, that is where the commission won't be able to step in and really, they could come down with a heavier hammer. But I think that the more kind of united as much as we can be on some of these issues, including periodic updates related to, you know, reviewing our mapping, making sure we're not being overly onerous on certain activities. And going through that process is going to just be kind of one of those first steps. And it's going to be, hopefully it's written as a 5-year program to keep updated so that we're not trying to deal with something to modernize a 20-year-old document in the first place and just capture that nexus of change, let alone be able to look another 20 years into the future with the policy document. So that is one of the things that we grapple with. And this plan, and as well as our admin manual and our coastal zoning code, are additional opportunities to get into a lot more of that detail on sources and find ways that we can keep things flexible to deal with the changing times, what we're considering. For example, if we did receive a biological report, that's not going to be the same today as it's going to be in another 5 to 10 years, right? And so we want to be able to set that up for success. And that's in that implementation plan, but that's the goal. That's kind of the turning point right now where we're trying to get.
Linda and I discussed this a little bit of Timber Cove, but we have this thing with the state owning a lot of ground. And they're not really doing anything with it. I mean, they I don't know if at the time they really had to sell the people on it, and in particular, 1,500 acres that originally was in my family. And I had 20 years of concession with the state up here by Goat Rock, and it's even hard for me to drive by and look at what it's like. I searched desperately for a picture that was taken back in the 70s when we were full force on it, and I don't know. I know the county has kind of had their disagreements with the state over the years, so it's kind of hard to come to the table and say, we think you need to do this, but they need to start managing their property. Sonoma Coast was happy for us to be there, and Sacramento says, you don't know what you're doing. And it was really difficult for me, and unfortunate circumstances, I gave the concession up. But and then now to watch it just go to ruin. And that's some good agricultural land, and the public won't even be able to use it very soon. It's so full of brush and stuff. Is the county gonna have any influence on the state? I mean, I know the extension service has talked about we need to get grazing back, but then you come back to this fencing thing. Okay, the fences are all shot. Now we're gonna have to put up fencing to put livestock back in there, and it just seems to be a total conflict.
So the state actually has their own separate exclusion order that we are in no way standing in their way of doing that work. I don't know what we have as authority to, force it. But if they did need to get a coastal permit for something that wasn't captured by their exclusion order for some reason, that would be the only avenue that we would have as a regulator. And we do grant coastal permits to the state agencies as well. Caltrans gets them for their road work, and just as reference, but we are not standing in their way from managing that land. They have a very robust exclusion order already in their favor. So I don't know how we can help to jumpstart getting that worked on, but I can say that we're not providing an obstacle.
They told me at the time that they were going to manage the land by burning, and when it can burn on the coast, it's scary. Other times it won't burn, it just won't. And so have they done any burning? No, zero.
There is a project going on right now, further north, where the state is employing some burns controlled, and they went over what their mitigations were going to be as far as making sure that they've got wind monitors up and things like that, just to stop things from getting out of control. So it is still in their toolbox. It does seem to be something that they're interested in using here on the coast. I haven't heard of anything further south than that.
Well, we don't want to see the rest of ag in Sonoma County. If the landowner said, we can't deal with this anymore, we can't afford to do what you're asking us to do, and then it all becomes wasteland like the state.
So does it feel like we're ready for the next subject? Or feel like we're transitioning? Okay, great. And one final thought, we're not, I've just been kind of chewing on this thing about the principally permitted use and ag, because it does, even if it ends up being sort of an allowed use that you don't need to have a permit, it sort of feels like a bit of a loss almost philosophically, right? Like, you know, this is something that's really important to our community and really important to the history of the Sonoma coast. And so, you know, removing it doesn't in some way feel like it's diminishing it from kind of a planning perspective. I was just wondering, like, is it possible to do like RRD-G for grazing and RRD-T for timber and actually like distinguish between those properties? I mean, I know that that would be like a huge amount of work, but is that something that could be sort of part of the implementation of the plan, like kind of called out as a program so that we would have an opportunity to kind of go into more detail, right? To look at your property that's, you know, 2/3 maybe -G and, you know, 1/3 -T, just so that we maintain, I guess, the primacy of agricultural uses on properties that have had this for hundreds of years.
So my recommendation from this conversation would be to look at what we have identified as, you know, resource conservation and maybe add land management and look at that definition where we would consider grazing to be a specific activity that would fall under that type of definition. And then any additional specificity would have to come through through the zoning code if that became necessary. So I know this is probably the one item that I personally have a lot of history fighting the Coastal Commission on and trying to create definitions that were broader than the initial allowance because they were trying to go microscopic. And at a land use level, that's just not appropriate for my opinion as staff, just working in planning. And so we were trying really hard to get these definitions to a point where we thought they could be certifiable, and we can look at that again of seeing if there's an opportunity to open that up a little bit more. And then accepting that the implementation plan, I think, is actually where the Coastal Act defines where the what the principally permitted use needs to be. We're in this situation because they actually disagree with our current local coastal program in general. So that's why it's being elevated up to that plan level. But I think if we try and go with like a broader definition, we can try it again. Not going to be able to open it up entirely, but open it up to include those management activities. And then, you know, except we're going to maybe need to get a little more specific in zoning. And that's probably where having multiple districts is going to be a more appropriate response. You know, we have a very narrow coastal zone here. So having more than the 10 or 11 land uses would probably be a bit overbearing just to try and manage and keep things consistent. But with zoning districts, we probably have one.
One follow-up. There's also concepts in the Coastal Act that if you have the vested rights to an operation before 1972, it was enacted, you are exempt from any of the regulations. And the way it's described, it's a person, that a person should be considered an operation or a property, I would imagine. And there are a lot of sort of ranchers and ranchers in the room that have done this, where these operations occurred pre-1972. Can the county do something to help us create a vested right program for ranches that have existing operations that exclude us from the Coastal Act?
Council.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at that. There's most of the places where the legislature did that, you know, was in the context of the Bain bill with Sea Ranch. The idea of vesting something that requires new development is not one that the Coastal Commission is going to necessarily embrace, but I think we can look at what we can do on that front.
I mean, that'd be wonderful, like it's an ag operation, existing perimeter and rotational fences, you know, water systems.
I mean, that is more or less the concept that was in the Bain bill. I would not get my hopes up on that, frankly, but I would like to take a chance to follow up on that.
That'd be amazing.
And I will say to that effect, not as technical as the vested right process, but we do also have situations where you know, we've been able to recognize something in a location it's not supposed to be and identify it as legal non-conforming, and so replacement of that, as long as it's the same thing is generally something that we can work with. So those are all considered on a case-by-case basis already. It would be great to have a more formal program. But if there is ever a question of something that's already existing and what can you do, one of the big bottom lines is reach out to us. You know, our staff is available. I'm available to try and help work through some of these opportunities where we want to help you find a path that's not going to include a permit. And part of that, Dennis, like your ears, is because I don't want to do the work that it takes to get through that permit process, right? And so, you know, and even if something's already happened, our staff doesn't report things to code enforcement unless there's a big public health safety issue. So just don't be afraid to take my card, take my contact information, and really reach out with some of these really nitty-gritty specific details of the circumstance, because we do recognize that everything, you know, is kind of a case-by-case basis, and we are trying to use sort of a broad brush here for a very diverse region, and we're trying to get to that point with the policy. But I just wanted to go ahead and make myself available to you all if you have more specific, you know, this is how I operate my ranch, what would this mean for me kind of questions. We'll get to as many of those as we possibly can in preparation for July. We may try and you know, block them out as much as possible to similar types of questions if we get a lot of them, just to help walk through some of those scenarios that we can't, you know, hypothetically go over every single situation there might be.
Okay, we're feeling ready to move on. All right.
So we have received a lot of comments related to easements, particularly related to public access easements. And then we also have had join us our parks planning manager, Steve Eric.
It's chairs.
Yeah, just really work on the spot.
Hi, everybody. Steve Eric with Regional Parks. We love grazing. We believe in grazing. We graze thousands of acres there. And we've done pile burning in Stillwater and Walla recently too. And we're working on a project along the edge of Timber Cove. So there is no presentation, but here to answer your questions
And
on
then,
easements.
To go ahead and kind of open up a little bit more of the discussion. One of the specific comments we got was related to the Coastal Commission ability to require easements, and we already are working on softer language related to that to, you know, have the policy language be more when to consider easements related to public access rather than the blanket approach the policy was written at now. That's just to require it, because again, that gets into a lot of logistical issues that we also would not want to enforce. So after a closer review, we wanted to bring that up as sort of the policy direction we're already heading is to really kind of notch that down, but we're also happy to have more conversations related to any of the other easement specifics that you all are concerned about.
The requirement for the easements, I think, has been in there since the original LCP, and only around 1980, 79 did we see the commission doing that in a knee-jerk way. And so there's a few of the offer to dedicate trail easements still floating around from that time period, but since then, I don't think we've seen one that isn't associated with a large increase of traffic. So typically there has to be a nexus, which is typically visitor serving uses, which in the coastal zone, either hotels or wineries, which we have barely just a few. So speaking from regional parks and county council or permit Sonoma, and can always correct things from their own perspective. We believe in working with willing landowners, and that's what we do. So willing sellers, that's how we've operated. So the existing policy in the LCP was carried forward, and that's why we're here talking.
The trails in the public access points in the proposed LCP that are not that have division priority 2 and 3, which correspond to the fire office that they easements. I appreciate the language is going to be stopped, but how did those acquisition priorities then get applied to things like big experience fast food or the neighborhood to that on things like that are not otherwise in the Sonoma Coast Integrated Parks Plan. How do we get acquisition priorities that we use a land acquisition program that is designed between the first public road and the beach? Coastal acts, but their acquisition, the uses of that program for easements is to get people from the first public road to the beach or to the waterway, and not to go cross country 5 or 8 miles.
Could you clarify your, yeah, thanks Renata, which part of your question should I start with? Right, so when, we had the technical update around 99, 2001. And then when, so there was a number of projects or adjustments that were made by Permit Sonoma then. And then when this draft started getting worked on in 08, I believe, 08. The Permit Sonoma looked around and said, well, what else is in motion? And so that's where the draft outdoor rec plan, that's where Sonoma Land Trust acquisition plans were identified, where there was certain properties that have now come to pass, like Jenner Headlands and so on. So there was a number of projects, and depending upon the feasibility at the time, so if it has recorded easements, for example, then they were included. So one of the routes you're talking about already had 4 or 5 different recorded easements. And so it was considered whatever acquisition priority 2, or I can't recall, but so it was a qualitative judgment call at the time.
It was made by or by regional products or?
There was a team back then, and it was about 6 people from Permit Sonoma and 1 person from Regional Parks typically.
Does this Permit Sonoma and the county, do you guys recognize that the Coastal Act uses that forest dedication of easements? But that's designed from the first public road to the beach. I mean, sort of, is there any conception, maybe legal counsel can weigh in on this? Do you think that this program, that using the Coastal Act's forest dedications are applicable to land east of Highway 1?
So I'll let my friend do the legal part, but just so you know, in our practice, as long as I've been director, there has to be a nexus and there has to be a rough proportionality, which are the 2 bellwether standards of the US Supreme Court on this issue. Those don't exist. It doesn't even come up. That's all I am.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that I don't think there's a forced dedication for access program that is specific to the inland of the first road distinction. No, I think that the Coastal Act has a broader concept of access, in which Highway 1 is one component of it. And this is one of the reasons that the Coastal Commission is very concerned, oddly enough, about vacation rentals, as they look at this as being a component of access to the ocean. So their conception of access and their conception of access under the Coastal Act is fairly broad, but that doesn't mean that there's a lot of dedications that are likely to happen or to be required. The nexus and proportionality requirements that are constitutional, are the foundation, the floor, the ceiling. You can't do anything that's different just because you're closer to the ocean. So in that regard, I think I would say, no, we don't have something that's specific to the first area, next to the roads, but you still have the same constitutional requirements. So there's not going to be anything that would be a forced exaction just because you're in that location.
How are you addressing the concern of scenic byway offset? I think that's how this has come up another time, that you're degrading the scenic byway. And so there's, you need to offer this easement as a concession. And I think the reason why this is a sensitive topic is in February, the Coastal Commission listed the North Coast as a priority for OTCs. That they want to see, at least 30-something% of OTCs coming from the coast. My property has 2 trails listed on the plan with a proposed trail going through it. And with introducing all these items that are going to require permits, I think it's a huge risk that they're of the pressure of offer to dedicates as a concession for permit approval. So what language are we putting in here to address that and make sure that that doesn't continue to go down that road?
So I can't, with the types of development that have been, but with your property or most of the other properties represented in the room today, how, especially with visual, right? Visual and aesthetics are so difficult to quantify. It's going to be a really high bar to, one, show a nexus, a connection to begin with, and then 2, to define that proportionality, you know, the scope and extent of the impact and the mitigation that the government would be connecting to it. It would be extraordinary. I can't even think about it. But you still have to go through, you can conjure all the policies and state statutes you want. That's a US Supreme Court decision. So that's what we listen to.
I just want to make sure that we're not setting a long-range vision. That's going to result, I mean.
Unintended
consequences. 2 jobs just to have to pay the farm and wrench out here. You know, let alone get legal counsel to defend something that's not clear, right? So
Not where we want to go here.
And I personally would like to see removal of any of the new proposed trails. That the last LCP, I know that those are added in. I know there's a lot of public interest in that, but the ones that go through private land, where those easements don't exist, you know, those need those landowners input, or they need to be removed. That's at least that's my stance. Maybe other people have other opinions, but you know, once that becomes a priority, then you've got the target on your back. So that's, I think that target can go away by not having it all there unless there's commission put it on there.
So these trails that you're referencing don't necessarily connect contiguous pieces of property, right? Well, what's been proposed is, from what I can see, is that there are pieces of land along that they're trying to find a way to connect by taking land. Am I right? Because this, basically that's you distill it down. That's what we're talking about. And what I'm hearing from you is that the possibility of them connecting those land pieces is very, very low.
No, what he was talking about, the scenic offset.
The scenic offset.
Something you're proposing physically blocks view of the coast. And as mitigation for that impact, somehow we could require physical access.
I see. So this has nothing to do with the actual trail that's proposed to go from, say, Occidental to the coast.
It does have to do with that, and what I want to make sure is that we don't have a way for that easement to be granted through a concession. If somebody wants to come pay fair market value for that, or somebody wants to use eminent domain or another legal process to get that, I mean, that's
or somehow demonstrate that visually blocking view of the coast justifies exaction of the charge.
okay. Or it just puts you at the mercy of the Coastal Commission. You put this in for permit,
Right.
and they want access as a concession in order for that permit approval. It could be for the scenic, it could be for any reason, but you're at their mercy to either say yes and then be one of those willing people who willingly give access, or not accept your permit. And you know, you got a 140-year-old barn that needs to be rebuilt, you need a permit for it. Well, you gotta give access for the waterfall, right? So my concern with LCP as it is right now is with all these new proposed trails on there, it puts priority on a lot of properties for that to potentially happen. I'm not saying that it's happening today, but between that and the coastal commission's desire to increase the number of easements, put that together, and it's a bad recipe. And I think it needs looking at.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that comment, and one of the things we started to discuss at staff is how we can remove or modify that language. We do have to have the acquisition priorities identified, and roughly identify what they mean, but it may just be a case where, you know, we would have to consider it in light of the proportionality nexus, everything else. We wouldn't have to require it, but it's something that, you know, maybe it's part of our process that we'd have to have a conversation about it. If you came in to get a coastal permit for something, you know, we'd have to talk about the potential for nexus and make maybe a finding or something along those lines. We're just trying to figure out that language here. We're not going to have that level of detail because it's going to be draft language that we're obviously going to need a lot of burn time on. But that is the more direction we're more interested in going, is acknowledging these acquisition priorities, but making it really clear that like it's a consideration, not a requirement. It would only be a requirement under some pretty extreme circumstances. A in-kind replacement would never get you there. But we recognize that even though we are policy practitioners, if that's not written down, that the concern over scope creep may happen over time, right? And so we want to set this up a little bit more to kind of head off some of that potential for scope creep related to that. And again, maybe set up some kind of finding we need to make in the coastal permit just to say that we discussed it and it didn't make any sense, something like that.
And I appreciate the clarity that you all already put on the maps of like you need permission to go on the property before you go. But I've already had trespassers on my property. They're like, no, this is public access. I don't like to go through it. I've seen this, right? And even though it's listed on there clear as day and it's proposed, I'm already getting people coming through on the property. And we're having to chase them off by the dozens, you know, and I mean, they're out there, again, you know, back to the bulls. They're out there with my bulls that are not ground, and it's a risk, right? And if somebody gets hurt, then it's my insurance, so it just wants to make sure that they can look at that.
Thank you, and I do see, just one second. I also just want to acknowledge that this, though we're looking at it in the context of the Coastal Act and coastal access primarily, this is still an issue that we do face inland with planned access points for other issues as well. And I think this language is, you know, we're going to lean towards a little bit more of a reflection of that. But I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, this is something that happens throughout the county, and we're still grappling with the best ways to handle that. There will be a little bit more detailed discussion about that type of issue as far as visually how it's represented. But we do still have some obligation to be identifying access, and how we do that is going to be where it comes to our local discretion. That's going to go before the coastal commission.
So this is going to be multi-part. But can you quickly explain to us why you need to identify the need to have the acquisition marked someplace in the LCP?
Maybe that's for permit Sonoma staff. So why does the LCP have had the acquisitions identified from, I assume it's part of it.
It did not exist in the earlier LCPs that I could find, to the extent that it does in this.
The existing LCP has dots all up and down the coast on public and private property for public and private recreation.
Do you have those maps? Can I see those? Because the maps I was given didn't.
Yeah, there's.
The only maps are 1981, correct?
Yeah, they're in there. In there.
Oh,
Some have a copy of the existing coastal plan. It's in the back.
Yeah, and I will say that it's consistent with policies inland. I actually was given, maybe it was by you, some map from like the 1950s that had the property that is now Monterey Redwoods in region, you know, and our newest regional park in the Lower Russian River, actually identified, I think, along with Corbell Park, right? That was, you know, so it's been kind of a long-standing policy. And one thing that I wanted to share that, you know, everyone can look up And just, I also want to be super clear on my kind of local perspective. I do not support in any way, shape or form, the sort of forced acquisition of easements. And I recognize that there is a process, through the coastal commission, and that is their prerogative. But from my perspective, we only work with willing sellers. And I think it's interesting sort of being on this side, because I want you to know that like government is very afraid of being seen as like the big bad wolf that's coming to take your property. Like the Ag and Open Space District does not want to be viewed that way. Regional Parks does not want to be viewed that way. Like we want to be viewed as a community asset that only works with willing property owners to bring benefit and joy to the public. So I just want to be very clear on that as a local perspective. But I've also been a big advocate for bicycle and pedestrian safety. And if you just literally Google like Vision Zero, and it for Sonoma County, it comes up and it highlights all of the segments, including segments in the coastal zone and including some of the trails that we have planned both on the coast and inland. We also want to connect Occidental to Monterey, and actually ultimately up to Forestville and all the way down out to Jenner. That we do see a lot of fatalities and injuries on our rural road networks because people drive like bats out of hell these days. And it's been a huge problem. They've wrecked the bodega sign, God knows how many times. They've crashed into businesses. And so part of, the way to combat that, at least from the bicycle and pedestrian safety side, is to try to create more Class 1 trails. And so, that's partly why it's sort of important to at least set a vision. Like we have no way, shape or form own all of the space that we need to connect Forestville to Jenner, right? But at least we have a plan so that if there's a property owner, along the Russian River that is willing at some point to part with it, we can say, okay, that could be part of, our Russian River Trail. And so, but I want to be very clear. I fully support softening the language and seeing what we can do within the confines of the Coastal Act to be clear that the goal is not to go in and, force you to dedicate easements in pursuit of something that should be acquired from willing property owners, for the benefit and the enjoyment of the public.
I really appreciate that, I really do. And what you can see in the public access in the LCP is that when regional parks, for example, has a Carrington Ranch project, there is no acquisition priority or development priority given to it because there's a different owner. Because regional parks own or ag and open space owns, and so there is no acquisition priority given to it because your organization own the development of that, and your, for example, your integrated parks plan says where you want to develop campus. So it's a known entity that you guys have studied. What's happened here with this LCP, no one, there are wish list access trails that have been put into the LCP that are not owned by regional parks and are not by organic ag and open space, but they're just a wish list from 2003, and they were put into the plan and then given an acquisition priority or two. So who owns that? I mean, that's as you said, the target's on our back. Who owns that? It's not regional parks doesn't own it, and ag and open space doesn't. But you're using the Coastal Act and using the state laws as a way for somebody to come and demand an easement from property owners along that trail. I mean, I would just I strongly agree that things like that should not be in the LCP as a public access point.
So no, that was great, thank you. So I see you have the maps up.
Yeah,
I've been singing this song for over 3 years about trespassing on private property caused by the, I believe the revision was in 2015, where the current revision plan went online and people were able to then go and take a look at this, duplicate those maps, put them on blogs and websites for hikers and cyclists and people who spend their free time trespassing. That is their bomb. So I was told that the dot on the map that I had originally been concerned about had been on those maps since 1981, since 2001, and they were not. Can someone show me where, for example, that for the Estero Americano, there were, other than the Marsh Road put in, other than that one put in, where are the dots on the map?
Yeah, there's the Marsh Road put in.
Right.
There's the coastal trail down to the county line.
That, well, right, but that's not what I'm talking
Short
about.
Trail and Pinnacle, Bordessa is not on there. Hepper and Dewar are not on there either.
Okay, so, but here's my point on this, and maybe I'm not being clear, and forgive me. The optics on this is awful. this is the same subject I've been bringing to the board, to permit Sonoma, and I was given the excuse that these dots have always existed, and that's not what's causing the trespassing. I have been requesting that any undeveloped public access point not be on any of these LCP maps because they're causing hardships. And then there's the issue that they mark the properties for a potential reduction in value. They mark the properties for hostile takeover, for lack of better terminology. Why is it that these maps with the wish list must be in the LCP and in such a fashion that it's damaging property?
So I'm happy to hand that over to regional parks, but I do just want to say something for the record, which is that trespassers are liars. I farmed for a decade on a property adjacent to the Russian River, and we broke up, high school drinking parties with 100 people that had to be broken up by the sheriffs. And, and because I was farming there and living across the road at the time, we would regularly interact with people who would completely make up stories the moment that you caught them, and we would know that it wasn't true because like the owner was my father-in-law, and, they hadn't talked to the owner, and my father-in-law had never did it. So they're gonna say anything to try to get themselves out of it. And trespassing is a problem whether or not you have a dot on a map. When you live in a place that's sort of between something that people want to get to, like the river or the coast, or not. So I do want to say that I think that even if these dots were to be eliminated from the map, that you would still have problem with trespassing because there are some people who just do that.
No,
So I just want to say that because like this is something that I personally experienced firsthand, and sometimes in kind of threatening ways too. Right, so it's usually not a pleasant interaction. People doing wheelies and like mud and damaging, the property and like having to chase people who are in vehicles. So it's a real issue, and I understand how frustrating it is, but I do think that it will occur regardless.
So agreed, there's always going to be poop heads that you need to deal with, for lack, not a sophisticated terminology, but what it boils down to. But I'm quite confident an 80-year-old woman trying to go through my gate saying that I'm looking for the SLT public access marker. Pretty sure she's not on it.
Well, and Beth, so to the point is, I think that the dots that you're talking about are proposed sites are, one would be the SLPPs on Estero Lane. It's showing on the LCP map as a proposed public access point. Why is that there? We met with SLT and spoke to them about that dot being placed there, and they said they don't know how it got placed there. So there's a proposed access site or dot on a map that SLT says we didn't ask for it to be there. It's there. And as a result of that, we're dealing with trespassers specifically looking for that site. Appreciate, we all deal with that trespassers. They lie, they do. We get that, but why aggravate it by putting a proposed site on there? The property isn't designated as a proposed site. Who put that dot there?
So
why does it, there's no need, there's no reason for that dot to be there.
The LCP, the way the format has been and is to recognize public and private places with recreation and education. So this includes the golf course at Bodega Bay, includes Sea Ranch private rec, it includes other private rec, it includes public rec. The Coastal Commission's direction has been to include all that. So it is a reflection of that greater policy. And so at the time that this was done, that was a facility that was hosting educational tours, and that's why it was recognized.
But there's one little difference. You talk about the golf course, you talk about Sea Ranch, they're public roads. That's a public road to get to that. This point on SLT, you have to cross private property to get to that. And there's no easement that would support that. No neighbor permission, no easement.
So
That's different.
I can't speak to the private property entitlements or any of that.
Well,
But actually Sea Ranch does have private roads.
But you just spoke to that.
Yeah.
You just said that dot was placed there because it had educational tours there.
Yes.
Because those educational tours cross private property that has to receive permission to attend that property. So a public access or proposed public access point serves no purpose there.
At the time, there was also tours off the coast and off Valley Forge.
Not. No,
So there was the moonlight paddles that were being offered. So it was a one way of using the navigable waterway. Look, I don't have a dog in this fight. The idea was that any place where there's public or private rec, that was where the LCP was laid out originally in 1980. Carried forward, here's the places where that was happening. If there's an existing property disputes, that's another matter. We're not the arbitrators, and I don't know. I look to council on what to say about that, but that's the genesis of this.
So I want to be clear that one of the policy options that we brought forward at the last hearing that we would continue to bring forward is related to, you know, more of a broad policy language in support of public access on the Estero as they come forward with interested property owners. Rather than necessarily it needing to be a point on the map. I do believe we need to carry forward the acquisition priorities. I don't know that it's not that they can't be changed, but we do have to have a public access plan as a component to our local coastal program. And that is where this is all originating. And there are some criteria, at least consistency wise, that the Coastal Commission does expect to see with those. But if it is not a point on a map, there will be some other just policy language reflecting something in a more broad tone for the proposed points, the proposed private points rather than some of the public points that we already have that exist. So that policy option did come forward, and that was specific to sub area 10 because that was the original board direction that we got. But that is the Estero area, which I think is the primary of what we're talking about right this minute. And so that policy option is drafted, and we can look at that language in more detail to see about the kind of interest that the group would have, maybe after this, or if we take a short break just to pull that up. But we did bring forward an option that just was more of a text related option rather than reliant on the maps. Specifically.
So just to clarify, I want to make sure that I heard you correctly, Cecily. So instead of having these proposed access points on these maps, there is the option to have some type of verbiage that in a document that will not point people towards these properties that do not have current public access. Is that what I heard? I want to make sure I heard this correctly.
Yes, currently, again, specifically written towards sub area 10 where we're seeing most of these issues, but that was a policy option that's brought forward.
Okay, thank you. But on that, since I've started this process, I have been told repeatedly by different people at the county and the permit Sonoma level that I'm the only one that's complained, that the sub area 10 people are the only one that have had any issues with this. And clearly we're hearing today that's not the case. And I've always known that wasn't the case, that it wasn't just us. I just was in a position, I think, in a level of an awareness to make the most noise. What are we going to do for everybody else? Because this isn't okay that these issues are happening through no fault of the owner when these maps are directing them to properties.
So all the other points, I think just about are on public property or public roads. So the intent of permit Sonoma was to align the dot as close as possible to the actual trailhead or the site where it's existing or proposed access. And if it's unknown, it's on Highway 1 nearby. So I don't know if does anyone know if there's an exception to that?
There are, I think otherwise it's the trails, right?
Yeah.
That's a different.
But the trailheads were on roads.
Yeah.
I'm just online, and yes, it is on Highway 1, and that is the start point. I think it was brought up earlier that the Coastal Commission currently is not accepting maps. And so I really do, one, I respect and appreciate the planning, and two, I think if it was generalized and in writing, you know, especially if there's language in there that as, you know, property owners are willing or desire to sell this access, and there was some language clarifying that, I think that that would be great. Because her point, a lot of these people have these maps and that's how they're getting the points. And that's how that information is getting out. And these people, maybe the trespassers are using it as an excuse, but we're handing them the excuse, right? So if we could make it a little less pointed on all those, I think it would be a huge asset.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. The one thing is some of the trail alignments in particular, we do have a little bit more direction, and Vern will confirm, or maybe Steve on the alignment, particularly for the California Coastal Trail. I don't know that that's one that we would be able to really avoid mapping. But as far as policy direction, that at least, you know, either broadens that, or even if how we visually choose to demonstrate it is a little bit broader, more blurry, less of an obvious, like this is where you would you know, put in or make it anything that would make it look like there's already a trailhead there. There may be some other visual sort of iconography options that we would look into. But I just want to put that out there that the California Coastal Trail also has its own special treatment, and maybe that one in particular isn't as likely to change. But we can look at other options for how we would represent it. And how we would continue to demonstrate the goals. And I think some of the reason for the mapping is from, you know, an implementation standpoint, you know, if it just says something like connect, you know, finding the language that would be specific enough in some of these cases to still actually support the goals of public access is another balancing act that we have to do. So I think that's why the sub area 10 one was relatively easy, because it's already a defined area. It's an area that we know has both a vested community interest in public access and also has these access issues related to the ability to use certain points or places. And so that's why that one was kind of the low hanging fish as far as getting that through. But there are other cases where maybe we have to look at policy language and figure out how we can still achieve that level of specificity that, you know, if he's going for a grant, for example, to actually purchase an acquisition, if there's no details on what that public access point is supposed to be, we are not likely to be able to get that funding and to, you know, help an interested property owner make that sale and be able to actually build and facilitate that public access. So those are the pieces that we do have to balance with this document. And how we do that with the maps is something that we will be likely to come forward with additional options on.
And I just also want to acknowledge that, you know, first and foremost, this meeting today was intended to be about agriculture. We kind of added the subject of the Estero partly because we knew that it would come up if we didn't include it in the agenda after we saw the RSVP list. And so, you know, if we were to have a meeting focused on public access on the coast or bicycle and pedestrian safety in the coastal zone in West County, this room would have a lot more people in it. And so I want to recognize that we sort of don't just hear from, you know, property owners. We also, I was actually on a meeting right before this one, and, you know, with the head of the Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition. And so there are sort of a lot of different interests as it pertains to public access. And so I think it's really important to hear this conversation, have the feedback, be able to bring multiple options before the Board of Supervisors. We had a conversation at the most recent Board of Supervisors meeting of, okay, if it's not a dot, is it a sausage or is it a shading, or is there, you know, like how, like, you know, what does it actually look like on the map so that reasonably someone can't come up to you and say, well, I'm on this dot right now, my GPS device says I am, right? You know, I Googled it on my iPhone and it pops up, or whatever, you know, the conversation is. So I think that's a conversation that we want to bring back to the Board of Supervisors, is really a suite of options.
I have a question. So you guys are supposed to fight for us, right, as ag owners, or the Coastal Commission make the recommendations. So we're asking you guys to take the marker off. Is that a yes or no? Can you do that?
So I will absolutely always fight for the right to graze on the Sonoma coast. I also represent a lot of folks who want to come and recreate on the coast. So, you know, and the other thing is that these dots on the map are also consistent with how we put dots on the map throughout the rest of interior Sonoma County. And that has actually resulted in the acquisition of some key parcels that are going to provide huge benefits and enjoyment.
You know.
And I am not committing to removing dots from the map at this point in time. but I am open to what those dots look like, where they are located. I think those are all really good conversations to have. But what's being asked for is different than everywhere else that we've treated the coast and how we've treated the coast historically and how we've treated inland. And again, we've accomplished with willing landowners for the benefit of the public, good things by having this kind of policy in the county.
So Linda, well, I was gonna say, we're here at working ranch properties, and we're here as working agricultural properties, and when I have people that have fences, they think they have access to drive to go through certain parts of our ranch. I have vandalism on the ranch. And a lot of trespass. So I'm saying, as a working land, I'm not here as somebody who has a piece of property that just wants to move to the coast and otherwise, we're here with these lands are our livelihoods in certain cases and we work to make them viable. So it's a different concept to talk about access and trespass on a working ranch versus something that's sitting fallow. And Sonoma County has 50% or more of the land that already public along the Sonoma coast. So there's a vast amount of public land available to develop at this point already. And what we're here for are we're trying to operate ranches and what's been happening with the access plan is making it much harder to manage the properties.
So if we want to transition to the dot conversation, which we had scheduled for this afternoon, but it feels like we're already segueing it. I'm happy to look at where the dots go, what they look like, how we make it really clear, that there is no public access point so that people can't, they would be willfully misunderstanding, they would just be lying to you, right? If we do a good job in the mapping section, in my opinion. I'm happy I think that Permit Sonoma was sort of prepared to lead that conversation and, to show what we have and to take feedback on bringing a whole suite of options back before the full board of supervisors.
So question for Steve. So why does the dot have to be on the LCP map?
That's not a question for me. That's a question for Permit Sonoma and the format.
I can understand the grant portion of that, but why does the dot have to be in the map?
So my example with the grant comment was because we would need to describe where we are intending to put the access. I'm not saying that can't be done with words instead, but it is significantly more of a challenge to, we don't want to get to the point where we have to identify parcel numbers because actually the map is not parcel specific. Despite the fact that, maybe some members of the public are representing that it is. So we're, like I said, trying to balance that, where if we get a descriptive language towards where we want to identify the public access, that would support everybody's needs, that may be an option, but we'd have to get through every single public access point that's identified that's not already existing, all of the proposed ones, and figure out how we could even describe that location without locking us into that much of a specific space, right? Because if it's a few doors, if it's a little ways up, the map is taken to be very broad. In this case, I realize the iconography used right now is not very broad, but the actual implementation of that is relatively flexible on where things will end. So
Steve's speaking to a specific piece of property. Words mean something. Words mean more than a dot. Words are what carry the language, the meaning of what's happening. A dot is just a dot on a map. So if what you're saying is you need that basically that language for the grant, why do we need to put a dot on a map? But really, the LCP doesn't need a dot on it. It has nothing to do with the grant or gaining access to a piece of property.
So for the public access plan related to our coastal plan, it is true that it may not be necessary to have a dot. We haven't approached that issue for all of the proposed locations. We are required to identify existing public access points. So there will still need to be any existing public access points identified. Proposed Again, that's a policy decision for our supervisors, whether it's dots, quadrants, however that may look, but we don't know that we are required to have it specifically on a map, as long as we still have public access language that is supporting. And so again, that is something that we can consider and bring forward as an option. But maps have been the way that this has been done countywide and in the original local coastal plan also. And so it was for consistency that this is the approach that was taken. And in some part also for clarity, to identify areas rather than using a descriptive language that different people might understand to mean different things. That's one of the big hurdles. We can't write down next to the big rock or something like that.
You should use an AP number.
And
They do that for grant
we
fees.
do
right?
try to avoid all circumstances when possible of limiting things to parcel specific.
But that's what we're limited to in this specific case we're talking about on the Estero and the LCP is a specific piece of property. I mean, I own property on the one side of it that there's no public access. So we're talking about a specific piece of property. Why do we need to use a dot to identify that? We could use language to identify it. And in other places in the county where you're speaking to a specific piece of property, you could certainly use an APN number, right? And that dot doesn't need to be there. We all live in the world of using these things to find everything, right? And when I pull up the LCP map and see a proposed spot, a dot, oh, I'm gonna go look for that. COVID's going on, I'm sitting at home, I got nothing to do, I'm gonna go look for it. And that was part of our problem. We saw a big increase in trespassing. And people looking, well, where's that dot? I want to see what it looks like. And everybody talks about the Estero and how beautiful it is and pristine. And yet we want to open it to the public and bring more people in. I don't see the point in that. Adding a dot just aggravates that.
And I don't think anybody is saying there's no public access, appropriate access, managed public access.
Right.
One of the things I'll add in here on the trespass front, our department did a study a while ago, many years at this point, but I think that it's still true. We pulled the trespass data from the sheriff, bunch of dots, plotted the dots out on the map and looked at where they were across the entire county. And this wasn't for confirmed trespass. This was where you're a bump in the night, the dogs bark and you call it in. So it's just saying, okay, everyone who thought they had trespassed, where are these? What we learned was a couple things. One, it reflected surrounding patterns of crime. So urban areas, we saw higher city limits type of thing. Two, where we had an attractive recreational resource without sufficient access, primarily the Russian River, we saw a lot also. And so we don't like trespass either at all. We try to, I won't say hunt them down, but our biggest nemesis is really the trail apps, honestly, the fishing blogs, the hunting blogs, the all trails, it's all that stuff. We don't see, maybe there's examples of people using government planning documents, but we saw everything blow up with the internet. And then from that point on, when occasionally we get reports off neighbors, because we don't want people going in parts of our property either. We don't want holes in our fences. We don't want our cows getting out either. So we have the same interest. And one of the bigger patterns with more population, COVID, of course, with more people discovering the outdoors, is we have a surge in people. So we're having to train, educate a whole new crowd of folks who are finally getting out. Good for them, but they're a little lawless, and we're getting a hold of that. Now we're also maxing out on parking, and we all have the traffic road issues. We all have destination stewardship issues. And so whether it's trash, whether it's trying to balance, where do we have too many people, where do we not have enough? It backs into the trespass issue by not having enough places that are well managed where people can go. And so the coast has kind of followed a similar trajectory through our eyes as parts of the Russian River, where it was pretty darn lawless. Like Steelhead Beach, first 4 years we owned it, our bathroom got torched all the time, just got burnt down. And now you go there, it's a great place for families, and it takes the load off many other areas. And so we've seen how there's been a gradual increase in burdening, lessening the burden in these other areas where we actually can have rangers, where we can have well-managed restrooms, where we can have regulatory enforcement, signage, and so on, and programming to support it. So that doesn't mean everywhere from our view, but one of the things we're all reacting against, us included, is trespassing, and that's where we're trying to do more outreach. We have the whole Free County Leave No Trace campaign underway. That's kind of trying to tie all this together. But if you do come across specific incidents of trespass where you are able to say, oh, they got it from this website or whatever, let us know. We do work with Google Maps. We do work with Apple Maps to try to take features off line, to try to hide certain things, to try to discourage it. But that's our big fear.
So Steve, we're doing it. It's the LCP map.
That's right.
Yep.
I'm telling you that they tell us because we're looking for that proposed site. It's because it was on the LCP map. And I can give you a case, a civil case right now where we're dealing with that. So you asked, is the LCP map?
Cecily. Come down to the basin. So you pointed out that the coastal trail gets better treatment because of its expansive public policy status. Tennis and Bernard both talked about extraction of access in the context of nexus and proportionality. Whether or not it's mapped doesn't change that. So you have projects that give significant development that would trigger the vertical type of access, which is direct public road to the coast access, would not be changed if it doesn't appear on a map. It would still be subject to the nexus and proportionality. Is that correct? I'm trying to just break it down into different categories to narrow. If mapping existing public access includes something like Sonoma Land Trust at the end of Estero Lane that is so substantially restricted and is not public access accessible, except by several thresholds of non-governmental arrangement with Sonoma Land Trust, I don't think that should be included on a map at all, because it's not actually access that is immediately available without some secondary process like permits. So those distinctions might help in your review of how it's treated.
So what we would do from here as staff is, hearing this today, we would go through all of our public access maps. Again, we already had a more verb focused policy option brought forward for sub area 10. We would go through the other sub areas and identify if it's possible or how, what type of language we would use to describe the proposed public access points that are on only private property. We would leave all of the proposed points on public property. And then to see how we would describe those, and then that is what would be brought forward as a potential policy option, potentially along with another way of, again, dots on maps, shading iconographies, because there is a lot of public interest in seeing this come forward in a more visual way that's easier for people to interpret. So our job is to provide the options, and that is where the way that we would do that is to consider, they used in the 2001 plan, for example, it was hollow dots were things that didn't actually exist. And there's different ways that that's been done throughout the years, where it's a different symbol versus a different color versus a different shading. And those are additional options that we would look to.
Really quick on that, and please tell me if I'm wrong. I'm going to use Short Tail Gulch as an example and Pinnacle Gulch. So those are already acquired and in development, but they haven't been completed yet. So other than those two hollow access points and a greater coastal area, not Sea Ranch, but, those of us down here. Are there other markers that, I mean, those were already under contract? Is that not correct? And that's why they were on that map.
I mean, those two came out of the 1977 legal settlement with the
Correct.
commission,
Correct.
but the Pinnacle was developed 15 years before Shorttail.
Right, but they were both there. Were they not both with they were both the hollow?
They were hollow dock because they were existing but not developed.
Correct, exactly. That's my point.
Yeah, so there was an existing and proposed differentiation before, and that is not the one in front of you now. So
Correct.
we're all of our other planning documents, we like the existing and proposed because it makes it very clear.
So thank you for that clarification. I'd like to address the sheriff's issue really quick. And I would not expect everyone to be familiar with the sheriff and the codes. Most of us deal directly with our trespassers. We're not going to waste the sheriff's time. He's got far more important things to do. So you're not going to get the verifiable data that way because it doesn't exist because we're not wasting their time.
Understood.
Thank you.
So I don't know if we want to, go ahead.
Is it possible to put that map up again that you showed? I have a question about it.
Did I understand you correctly to say that you already reviewed some area 10 and you're not going to do that again? Because wasn't that the area of concern?
No, so, do you have a specific question on the map?
Yes, I see where Route 1 is, but there's a black line that's going up in the hills there. What is that black line? Yeah, that one.
That's the coastal zone boundary. It's a felt tip marker that
Okay.
took Permit Sonoma a good year to clear up because it has a width. I kid you not.
Oh, okay, thank you.
That's how old this is.
I was just
I
wondering,
took a committee to figure out how to make it a finite line and then certain parcels where the in and out.
okay, and then the second part of this then is, can you show us where that dot is on the Estero Road? Or where those proposed points?
They're not
are?
on that map. Right.
They're not
No.
on this
No.
map.
She'd like him to show her on this map.
Right, where that is, yes,
I think that's Estero Lane, right, everybody?
Yes.
yes.
And so the land trust property is right in there. So again, the exercise was when Permit Sonoma went to update the document, they said, well, what else is out there existing and proposed? And this was something that was an existing holding with use. Now, maybe that use is it legal or not?
Condition, whether or not that defines that existing, given its limited scale.
Right.
Right, and similar, again, your comment, Eric, Commissioner Koenig Schofer, is that if it requires a secondary action, maybe it shouldn't be in there, but actually the entire LCP has a whole bunch of it. It's bizarre, it's different than our general plan. It is where it recognizes private access. So it has, again, Sea Ranch trails, all the roads are private there.
But I would start with this. To identify access points, public or private, that exist. You can identify them. I don't think there's argument about that. The issue is, and the coast is afraid of because of its status category. The question is, where it doesn't exist, what do you say? Can it be done with text as effectively without doing the iconic iconography on the map? That, to me, that's parameters of the site.
Yeah, that is what we are to be exploring, yeah. And then to answer your question, you had asked if we were going to be re-reviewing sub-area 10. The reason I just said that we already brought forward a policy option that has sub-area 10 without the proposed dots. That says, where there's willing, I don't remember the exact property, like the exact language, but it basically encouraged access in the Estero in sub-area 10 rather than, because that is such a unique feature that I think that however it would happen, as long as it's well managed, and it would require a coastal development permit. And we do resource assessments if there was going to be a proposed public access point developed there. But that was a unique feature because sub-area 10 really is specific to that space. That language we'd already brought forward and we can, it's still an option. It wasn't like that was said, that's not going to happen. But the conversation is broader than that, right? Because there are all these other sub areas too. And whether or not it's treating a specific area, given its unique feature, differently or not, is another policy decision. And so I wasn't saying we can't continue to explore options related to sub area 10, but I think that's the one that we already have those options brought forward to be at the decision table, whereas the other areas, there wasn't direction previously to go to that level of detail and try and explore individual access points and how we would, verbally have tried to describe Scotty Creek, for example, beach where Easements Beach at the new Highway 108. How would we have virtually tried to describe that compared to at the time that one was one that did have an identity, right? And so those are the ones that we need to look through, all of those private points or current private.
I know that access and hiking is a huge issue, and quite frankly, I mean, maybe not everybody in here agrees with. I'm in favor of it because the more places you get people to go, the less likely they are to trespass on our property. And the other thing I'd like to add, I know we've had a lot of discussion around the map and all that, but there's people that are planning to not give that access for a long period of time. They don't want that, right? And there's other people that are. And I would hope that however we move forward with this, we can move forward in a way that there's some flexibility. So that way, instead of being specific to a certain location or a certain path, that there's some flexibility to that. So you can take advantage of more people that are willing and want to give that access and ultimately be successful in this endeavor, right? I mean, we see all the tourists come, they need a place to go. So let's have more flexibility in that. And whether that's saying, hey, generically, we want to go from Bodega Bay to Occidental, that's great, right? There's probably 15 different ways that you can get there. And so I guess my ask would be, however this gets moved forward, that if it could be moved forward in a way that is as flexible as possible. One, it's going to help us get the trails, and two, it's going to get the crosshairs off the people that don't want the access and don't want the trespassers.
And I think that you have a room full of people that would be very willing to be on an ad hoc committee or an advisory committee that works directly with you, Cecily, to develop that verbiage so that you are not inundated, and then you can see what we wrote. Obviously, you and tenants and board of supervisors would be the end game on it, but we're very, very happy to come to Permit Sonoma and work on it in the conference.
We don't have one. Oh, no, we have only our front conference.
Yeah. And then I just wanted a clarification. Please forgive me because I've got a hearing issue in one of my ears. But you were talking about being on the phone with someone from the Bicycle Coalition before the meeting started.
Yeah.
Now, Gary Helfrich was the head of the Bicycle Coalition. I don't think that you were probably talking to somebody in the British Isles. Who is currently that point person at the Bicycle Coalition?
It's Eris Weaver. We were on a meeting about a climate funding initiative through the Regional Climate Protection Authority. She's the chair of the Transportation Committee, along with Alexa Forrester, I believe, is that her name? Who is the Sonoma State professor who was recently in the newspaper about bike and pedestrian safety.
Yeah, and very good article by it. Thank you. I wasn't sure who that point person was. Thank you so much.
So I mean, kind of bringing about the conversation that we were hoping to have was what would be alternatives if the dot placement is causing confusion. So one would be language, that is tricky and in some ways could potentially paint the same sort of bullseye on your back that the map does. There are different ways of utilizing different iconography that could make it more clear about proposed versus existing. There is sort of the shading versus a dot, or, you know, a trapezoid or a sausage or whatever was discussed in the most recent word meeting. So I know we were planning on having that conversation after lunch. I don't know if we want to take a break, or you know, if we want to just sort of keep going and see if there are alternative suggestions. I mean, I know we've had conversations that happy to move the dot so that doesn't align with anyone's driveway, right? Happy to increase signage in the area, sort of noting that, you know, all property sort of off of the road is private property, and installing kind of permanent signage, you know, increasing it to be very, very clear so that trespassers really have no argument to make when they try to show you their iPhone, and it's, you know, it's just simply their, you know, willful misunderstanding. So there are different strategies that we can take to try to address the issue of trespassing. I mean, my personal goal is to, you know, address trespassing issues while also preserving the public's kind of desire to increase access in particular areas that would also make us eligible for grant funding, you know, so that we can show, hey, we do have a plan. It's more than just a concept. It does have a level of specificity, and to ultimately create more access points, to your point of trying to decrease trespassing in the long run, give people a place to go so that they aren't going across private property. And that's a strategy that we've really taken aggressively in the lower Russian River, because there's, you know, so many issues down there as well. So what are we thinking? How's everyone feeling in terms of, like, do we want to actually discuss iconography? Are there any things that Permit Sonoma wants to share in terms of potential options, or take a break, right? Or take a break.
These people before at the break on the ag side, I know we talked about grazing and fences, but there's a much bigger element to running ag, you know, and like we talked about, we can ask this at the board supervisors meeting, which was help us with some kind of ongoing waiver program for the de minimis activities that will not require a permit, like water distribution lines for livestock, and, you know, certain size of, you know, storage tanks, grading, things that, you know, things that we do that are not in the categorical exclusions today. But that, I don't know, but I think might trigger development permits, that are ongoing agricultural activities that you know, that make would be far too burdensome to come into the county to request. So I know like Marin County did this, it's rated as a program for agriculture, and they included a lot of these things in that program so that, you know, producers don't have to go in and ask for permits.
So I do believe everything that you described would be covered by the exclusion orders, but we can also look at the de minimis program in Marin and see how that's gone. So the exclusion order for agro is written broadly enough that it would cover all those accessory activities,
including water.
Yeah. Yeah.
See that.
So it may not be specifically listed, but that's where, you know, if you were to have emailed me that question, the response for your record would have been a confirmation that, you know, this is an excludable activity under that exclusion order. And then I retain those emails because we are legally obligated to report these or have these available to the Coastal Commission should they ever ask when we have used our exclusion orders. So if somebody sends me an email, they're looking at a more formal process, but hey, you know what, if an email gets you out without having any issues, so that if code enforcement does show up at your door and you've got an email from me saying, hey, yeah, my neighbor called on this, but I've already checked, it's an excludable activity, here it is, you know, go talk to Cecily. Then, you know, code enforcement would confirm that the scope was within what you told me in the first place, and we'd be done with the whole issue. So that is where the exclusion orders do need to be recorded anytime that they are used. And again, it's not really a formal process. There's no permit fee. It's just a communication. You know, we used to have a form that we would fill out and keep in a binder that now weighs like 25 pounds in the office that nobody's opened. But now we do it via email to have that record of confirming the scope of the work and that it matches the exclusion order. And so again, with everything you just described, I would have used that. But we'll still look at what Marin's got and see if they have something in there that is gonna, in our opinion, or provide any additional opportunities that we're missing.
Great, thank you.
We don't want to open up our exclusion orders the
No.
existing ones, because we don't want to risk losing anything that you guys already have exclusions for, right? And so everything that we develop in implementation is going to be kind of guided more towards, do we need additional exclusion orders on this? Do we want to use some additional definitions related to some of these things? That's sort of where the strategy is there, rather than to try and open up and add uses to an existing exclusion order. We wouldn't want to risk that.
So thank you very much, Cecily, for that. I just want to clarify again, I'm gonna blame I do have a hearing issue. So if we take a break, then we'll come back and get to the actual, get more into the Estero Americano. Is that what you were saying, Supervisor Hopkins?
That was the question, is do we want to just sort of, transition into, what the dots could look like? I think Permit Sonoma was sort of, prepared to facilitate kind of an afternoon conversation, or do you want to take a 20-minute break and come back at 1? I have a hard stop unfortunately at 2:30, so we've already done by then. Okay, so.
Take a break.
Okay,
So
all right,
there's still some things that could come back into the conversation, 20 for everybody.
let's begin at like 1:05. Thank you. With our planning team for the break, I think it'd be really helpful to talk about specific dots, like which are the ones that are raising concerns. Obviously, we have the one that's in the Estero that is adjacent to a driveway that I think has been identified as very problematic, and one potential solution that we were discussing, we put sort of out toward the ocean, because really the goal is to ultimately create public access that would allow folks to recreate on the navigable waterway, as is their right per California law. So like that's one potential solution that would, I don't think that any sort of trespasser would have any standing if, that like your property is not the water, and again, if you pushed it out towards the ocean, that wouldn't have any property adjacency challenges. So that's one potential solution, but totally open to others. And then would also like to hear any other identified dots that have been problematic or are sort of, appeared to be problematic.
Linda, I think the one that you're speaking to is the one that was near our driveway, and it was the coastal trail, maybe not public access, but it was noted, carried the same insignia as proposed public access.
Okay, and I think that we had already discussed about the coastal trail of having that along the highway.
Right.
So,
But it carried the same, we call them dots.
Okay, great.
Dot is what.
So clearly there's a need to clarify the iconography, I think is what they call it, right? So that's problematic. But it sounds like we have a solution potentially to the trail, moving that, whatever icon dot thing is, to Highway 1, and sort of being, with the Estero, like we could actually put desired public access in the water, because that's ultimately what we want to get folks to.
So I have a problem with that, because that's going to create yet another problem. There's already an issue, for example, in the Estero Ranch with the markers and how they're impacting them. If you put that public access markers straight in the water, people are still they're going to then get in a kayak, that they have the right to do, and come in Valley Forge, or be acknowledged and vetted, put in. They're going to come in through there, and then they're going to, okay, well, where's the public access? And they're going to go on to the cattle ranch.
So do you have an alternate proposal?
So the alternate proposal is to get all the dots off of those maps and have it in writing, come up with some type of appropriate verbiage and description of a proposed public access someday. And I'm not using the right words. I am very happy to work with anyone to help come up with that appropriate verbiage. I'd be more than happy to volunteer as much of my time as you need to do so. And regarding the coast trail on Highway 1, that would be then in alignment with what Marin County is doing as well.
Well, I think probably Steve might have some clarification on that. Should we briefly sort of review the alignment of the California Coastal Trail?
Sure.
That'd be awesome.
So yeah, the entire coastal trail should either be on public property or mapped as Highway 1. That was the direction of Permit Sonoma quite some time ago.
So there's I think it's called a braided segment, and please forgive me if I'm not using the correct terminology, that comes down Short Tail Gulch, goes along the beach, which is nobody disputes that public access, but it ends halfway in the Estero. And that's causing problems when the sandbar is closed. People are assuming they will walk across the sandbar and then trespass onto the Spoleto Ranch, or they'll keep walking until they're faced in Marin County, faced with a sheer cliff. And then the tides come in, and then we've got a problem. So, can we definitively end that? If we're going to keep any marking on the beach there, it comes from, all the way from Doran, Short Tail, all the way down, it comes to, the Wildlands Beach. Is there any way to either stop that at the safe point, right at the edge before it enters the public doctrine of the Estero on the sandbar, instead of having it right in the middle of the Estero, when we back it up to the edge of the rock? Or just get rid of it on that area altogether, because the beach is public access, undisputed public access, just lose the braiding altogether.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I think you're talking about the line there. So
Yes.
it's the way it's illustrated now is coming down to the county line.
The county is now, is that sub area 10 or sub area 9?
This is 9.
Okay, if we go to 10, it shows it ending halfway into the Estero, doesn't it?
No, the water, your trail stops. Your trail comes from Pinnacle into the water. It's drawn, your California Coastal Trail is literally drawn in the water on map 9. And on map 10, you don't continue it in the water. It's not there. It's disappeared. But in your wording, you have a trail, the California Coastal Trail from Doran Beach, stopping at the Marin County line at the Estero Americana.
So they did remove that one piece.
Yeah, I believe it's the same way it's been now for.
Basically saying it stops at the Estero Americana, but there's no connection at the Estero Americana into Marin County, as you should all be aware of, because I wrote you guys numerous letters for many, many years, and finally did a malt letter to malt stating that there's no potential of a California coastal trail being put on the Marin County side after you cross over the Estero Americana. There's no connection. So that's not possible. So you have to loop the California Coastal Trail back up onto somebody's property or take it off the California coast, because putting a trail in the water and asking people to walk on it is detrimental to the coast habitat and detrimental to people's safety. It's ridiculous. And with climate change and sea level rise in the potential years, you're gonna ruin your whole coast. Why not keep the California Coastal Trail in your wording on a bluff 50 feet away from the bluff's edge with vegetation in between the bluff and the trail? That's your word. The California Coastal Trail should not be in that area at all. It's dangerous to the coast and dangerous to people's public safety. There's no salt surface, there's no rescuing, there's no rangers there. It's just detrimental. So your second alternative is to place a California Coastal Trail on Highway 1 to be continuous with Marin County, as Marin County has suggested. Marin County has said they will not put the California Coastal Trail along the Marin County coast at the Estero Americana due to public tri-shear cliffs. It would affect agriculture and for public safety. They recommend to keep it on Highway 1. And that's one of my concerns for many years, is keep people safe, keep the beautiful environment protected. Place a California Trail. So sorry to do that, but it's not possible due to the sheer cliffs and the water and no beach and not maintaining it. California Coastal Trail has to be maintained permanently and all the time. You can't maintain a trail that's placed in water. So that's one of my concerns.
The mapping is carried over from the way it was in 1980 in this regard, and the text also at the time said it goes from Mendocino to Marin. We did add the route along Highway 1 that you're asking about.
And we're grateful for that.
And right now, there's no development that's proposed for that, the little stretch from Short Tail to the Estero edge. That's just tidal like many other places.
Your wording in your LCP as of today in several places states the California Coastal Trail goes along the coast and stops at the Marin County line. It's not gonna connect there ever. So a California trail needs to be continuous. It needs to connect to the next county. It can't. So you need to remove it. And
So
put it back
one
on Highway 1.
One of your observations is that it's possible for it to loop back.
That's right.
Yeah.
But at this time it doesn't. So you're confusing people in your wording and in your maps to walk that piece of land, and it's detrimental to the coast and the coastal environment.
We're happy to provide additional safety-oriented information at our trailhead over there. It's become a real issue.
So.
Yeah, and I do also want to mention that actually, the county is currently spending $3 million a year in perpetuity, to provide fire services to, Bodega Bay, which is now, run by Sonoma County Fire District, which does provide services to this area, and that we're coordinating very closely with them on messaging as well. And we also spend God knows how many millions of dollars on Henry 1, which, has provided helicopter rescue services, not only to the Sonoma coast, but also.
But having a trail drawn on maps in a water for people to walk on is ridiculous.
And you can't fix stupid. I mean, if anyone tries to walk on water, it's just like, it's gonna
trail. And you're
Come on.
advertising people to walk in the water along the coast. It's ridiculous.
There's
That's what I'm saying.
the coastal trail guidebooks describe how to get down to this area. And I think that's the historic intent of when this was added 40 years ago. It takes a low tide and you can actually go and not trespass and enjoy the coast. You enjoy the entire coast right there.
You hike that trail before?
Many times, actually, yes.
You've gone on.
I wouldn't even call it a trail, it's a route.
It's
Yes.
trail. We're walking on rocks and
Yeah,
a little bit of sand and.
I even took my parents down there back when my dad was still alive. They
Well,
loved
I
it.
would recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah.
For just the general public, you're damaging the coastline and you're promoting damaging the coastline.
And the
With climate
connector
change and sea
between
level
Pinnacle
rise.
and Short Tail is also another one that's
It
kind of.
should be addressed.
Yeah, Steve, maybe this is much for you. I'm just wondering, is there an owner for, trails? Just in general, if there's an existing trail or a proposed trail, is there a government owner for these? And one of the reasons I asked, you mentioned earlier, there's not enough places that are well managed, and I agree with you. I think the county has done a good job of sort of acquiring some of these easements and parks and stuff. They don't have to do a good job of managing it, probably because they don't know. What's agreed on who actually owns it or the swamp. Or if there's, it's not well maintained or something like that, is there a government organization for each trail that we did? That's what we look to fix.
Yeah, so in the LCP, as far as existing facilities, it'll say who the owner is and who the manager is. Sometimes they're different. And if you have concerns about any of our county facilities, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it later. But yeah, in terms of proposed features, typically general plans, local coastal plans don't necessarily assign owners. You go back in time, at one point, use Jenner Headlands as an example, that was going to be county 60 years ago. Back in the 1960s, it was originally proposed. What is it now? It's nonprofit. The Willow Creek was proposed as county back then too. It's state parks. So these features change over time in terms of until it's actually acquired, until you see who buys it and how it's developed. And then sometimes groups contract with each other to do the management of them. So in some cases, you take our Sea Ranch access trails, bluff retreat's been a real issue. And that's been really hindering us on the maintenance up there. With some of the ones we took over, we know that's a struggle. And then that's we'd like to think that most of our others are fairly well maintained.
On the, this is just me being not familiar with it, we don't need to be the new one. Every trail that's existing has an owner and a manager, both the existing LCP and the new LCP.
Yes.
Okay, and that,
Yeah, it isn't just willy-nilly with the, and again, one of the confusions, it says access point / trailhead, and that includes private rec facilities as well, like golf courses and Cassini campground and facilities like that. So maybe one idea as to how to differentiate that a little bit more, that it also includes private. But for everyone, both public and private, it says who owns it and who manages it, as far as existing. And now that style was carried forward.
In the case of like the Sonoma, the big special trail, it says owner, manager, public / private. In that case, when there's, it's not parks, it's not California parks, regional parks.
There's a public trail easement with multiple on private property, and it's not clear who would implement them necessarily.
Is it only who's the owner in this case? Parks the owner?
Some of them are County of Sonoma. And some of them can be county or state.
In this one in particular, do you know who would be who's the owner of the database Fast Trail, who's the main agency?
Of the whole thing, no, it's just like the coastal trail has many different segments, right? Some are privately owned, but there's public access. Some are county, some are state parks. So you have a whole tapestry.
So it's segment by segment, not sort of the entirety. And some of it, might be actually transportation and public works, sort of actually along, and with the road
Caltrans.
itself, right, or Caltrans can also, so you can also have public works agencies.
just to be clear, those are agencies, and you can identify them. We're not saying the whole trail has, but you can identify this segment is owned by this.
Yeah, the whole trail, as far as the coastal trail goes, California Coastal Trail, the overseeing agency is the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Conservancy with state parks. Those are the ones that look out for the entire state, but then it's up to the local jurisdictions to stitch it together. And it's about halfway developed here in Sonoma County. Some counties are 100%, some are less.
Question, moving up the coast a little ways. Is there a proposed trail north of Ocean Gulch? Is that marked on a map?
It should show as Highway 1. We'll see. So you can see it on Highway 1 through here, all the way up. There's the switchbacks. And then you get to state parks, and then it's showing Vista Trail and state parks. So the way it was mapped, and it should be mapped consistently, is if there's not a if it's not established or public, it shows up as Highway 1. And then the text says it doesn't know, it gives a begin and an end point, says it doesn't know how it's going to get there.
Yeah, because it's a law, I mean, but I was just curious if I had heard rumors that, I don't know, if it's the county or the state were proposing to go off of Highway 1 and go up to Myers Grade area, and I wouldn't want to see that written on the map.
Yeah, well, we're not involved in that right now.
Okay.
That might have come from just like fears over closures too, because I know that there's been a lot of conversations over, Highway 1 closures that then force folks up onto Myers Grade, which is really not suitable for that level of traffic. So it might have been one of those games of telephone that had happened.
But there was also a couple different properties that were on the market for a while that different agencies considered. So could be related to that too. But you can see it's on the road.
So Steve, if we could just really quick go, I'm so sorry, I'm not meaning at all to beat a dead horse. But I think if you were to go back to, I think it's access map 9, the one that shows Short Tail Gulch, the one before that. And if you go down to past Bodega Harbor, and maybe I'm looking at an old map, right, and you see you can see the trail. And it literally goes, it's a trail marker, it goes it's coming down Pinnacle Gulch, Short Tail Gulch. And that trail marker goes along the beach. Halfway into the Estero, doesn't it? I was just looking at it on Claudette's computer. It's actually, you know what, it's sub area 9, not to sub area 9.
I just see a brown line.
Isn't that brown line the trail marker?
Yeah,
The next map.
yeah, it was left the way it was in the existing LCP going to the county line, right? That's the
In the
point.
middle of the water. It's on the other map.
Yeah, sometimes it's water, sometimes it's
So
sand.
I think we could solve several problems. If we take it out of the water. Have it end right where the land ends, no one's saying people can't walk on the beach. Let's get that trail marker out of the water, because sadly, as Linda was saying, there's stupid is, right? You can't stop stupid. But nonetheless, it indicates that trail hooks up in Marin County, which it does not at that location, nor will it ever. So if we just stop it at the edge of the land, then there is not that confusion right there. If we could just stop right there, we don't even have to, keep the braided part that comes down the gulches on the beach, that's fine. But if we could just get it out of the water, that would really be a step in the right direction of not indicating to people that trail connects at that location to Marin County, because it does not, nor will it.
So we can look into options iconography about the end of the trail, or Supervisor Hopkins, just general Estero access point. Maybe that's, it's a little bit further up, and that's a dead end point to it. But I also want to just go ahead and say that these maps, the coastline is not mapped based as nicely on the actual geography and land formations as we would like. There are many of these that are actually carried forward from the assessor parcel boundaries. So the specific line that's drawn, if you look at it visually on an aerial, may not match the actual end of where the land is. And so that's one of the things that we continue to try and work on it, and we'll do our best. We have some limitation based on just the geographic information systems that we have, our GIS mapping. So I just want to make it clear that there is a visual limitation on it as far as like pushing it onto the land or something where it would otherwise be following the parcel boundary to the best of our ability. But we can look into that a little bit further, and some of these areas with more specificity, it might be easier to go in and do a custom programming that would, trying to get the little wiggle of our extremely beautiful rugged coastline. That might not be something that we can do.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find an appropriate compromise on some of these issues.
I have a question. Is this the only piece of the California Coastal Trail in Sonoma County where it's in the water? Because if you go up the rugged coastline, does it actually, is there any other similarities of the coastal trail up the coast?
Yes, there's, as far as the county goes, but definitely the state. There's
The county that
the whole
says
bunch.
you can only access this trail during low tide. You have that explicitly along this section of the coast. You cannot access this trail if it's a high tide, because you'll be walking in the water. When the tide goes down, you're walking on all the sea life. So, I mean, that's basically what you're saying and what you're doing. You drew the map. If you open up with my phone, I could see the yellow line going right in the water on map 9.
So let's just talk about.
And if you didn't continue to map 10 in the water, you did just stop there. Why isn't the line on map 10?
The way it was mapped was based upon how the existing coastal plan is, which said that line goes to the Marin County line, so that's how it was mapped. It wasn't mapped, and it's partly, and there's many examples. So the coastal rail has to negotiate every single river up and down the 1,200 miles. A lot of that's only passable in the late summer, so we end up with braided routes. That's a pretty typical treatment for the eel, the Smith, and so on. So that's, I mean, it's not inconsistent with the rest of the state. This is why it is. I'm not arguing for saying we should do this or that. I'm just trying to explain to you why it is the way it is. It goes back to the text language saying it goes to the county line. Can that be changed? Sure, it can be changed, but that's why it is the way it is.
So, and I appreciate very much everything you just said, Steve, but just to clarify, on map 10, it stops at the edge of the bluff, is that what you're?
No, there's no California coastal trail on map 10.
But it is
But
on
the
map.
the wording on 4 or 5 pages in your LCP says it stops at the Estero, it stops at the Marin County line at the Estero is the word. And at that position, there is no attachment into Marin County. There's no possible way you can continue the trail farther into Marin County at all. Zero, none. You have to fix it, remove it.
And that malt has language very specific.
Yeah,
to
I
that,
sent you
correct?
guys all the letters.
Yeah, understood. I'm not arguing
Okay,
any
so
of
I'm
that.
just here today to just let you know that's, sort of, just in case you didn't see our letter, that's what's happening in Marin County. There's no California coastal trail in that area.
Yeah, understood. And that's why we have the coastal trail on the map
Highway 1.
on Highway 1, which is pretty challenging, as you can imagine. And so that should go with how the Marin board voted, right?
Perfect.
Yeah, so there it is.
Thank you.
It's been that way for a number of years now.
So we just wanted you to take out the wording out of your LCP stating that the California coastal trail is on highway, on the coast, on those 4 pages.
It's braided, right? And we have different options for folks to walk
But
along.
people won't understand unless it continues down the Estero.
I feel like I've heard your point, loud and clear, and would love to have an opportunity to hear from other members of the community. Oops, sorry, someone's trying to call me. Regarding other concerns with respect to, dots or lines on the map that we can discuss more specifically.
I've got an idea, an alternate proposal. Instead of having dots on the map, why wouldn't you just shade the whole Estero and say that this is an issue that we'd like to have public access to? And that, so she said the dots are there to get future funding, grants. Well, I would think if you didn't have, if that was a real issue and a landowner wanted to give you access that didn't have a dot on it, it could be an issue if you shaded the whole Estero. Took off the dots, it would solve all problems, I think.
I really appreciate that. We actually talked about that, and there was some slight concern because there is already other shading for something else. I don't see it actually on this, but someone was mentioning the preserve.
It's
so
let's see if we can blow it in. So it doesn't mean it can't be done.
cross we'll find, we'll look at something, but I appreciate that. And that was something we came out to do.
With wording that
Yes, and shade it. This is a goal for public access.
So here's an example
Estero
of shading right there.
Yeah, the whole Estero.
Okay, gotcha. So we could kind of cross hatch over and work on that, or outline the Estero in some dotted fashion or something like that, that we'll come up with some options.
The waterway.
The waterway, correct.
So regarding the Bordessa, public access, Martha, that's causing also some real serious issues. We all know, or most of us in this room probably know, that at a point it was the Ag and Open Space Regional Parks, please forgive me, purchased a easement type on the Bordessa Ranch that's kind of halfway in the middle there. It's not the Bordessa property to the Valley Ford side. But the appropriate easements have not been purchased to date, nor are they likely going to be in the near future. So
I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. That's a legal statement that's incorrect.
okay, help me with that.
Okay,
And
so the open space district acquired a floating trail easement. And the easement has not yet been designated. And A floating trail means that it's identified as a area where you can put it in the multiple locations. It's not a line.
Right.
Okay, it's a map to the water, right? Is that
No.
what you're saying?
No, it means it's undefined at this time of being a geographic
And
area.
this- What marker is
I can't remember. The Bordessa.
this? Right, yeah, but.
Right, I can't remember off the top of my head, is that J3?
J2?
I believe it's, help me out, Steve, is it Bordessa J2?
Yeah, or J4, this guy right here. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, so
so. All right, so it was a floating trail easement. Again, you're gonna have far more information on the verbiage and the logistics of this than I am, and obviously that Bordessa family is not here today with us, but there is still large pieces of this that have not been purchased, that need to, puzzle pieces, so to say, that need to get plugged into place.
That is incorrect. So there was a large amount of money that was spent on that trail that
Right.
the open space district and the county have the ability to designate a trail that either goes down to the Estero or that doesn't. And we've been in active discussions with the Bordessas.
Exactly. Are you, okay, I don't want to. Was there a left-hand turn lane purchased? Was there an easement purchased that will allow access to vehicles to that property? I want to make sure I got my facts straight.
There's a planning process for that, and we've been in active discussions with the Bordessas.
Right.
I guess what I would say is that the open space districts paid quite a bit of money on this, for this, and had a frustrating relationship with that particular property owner, who, actively tried to thwart, the bargain that they entered into. And that's not really good business, and I hope that, we don't have to deal with that in the future.
So nobody wants to jump in no one here wants to jump in the middle of the legal conversations going on. The Bordessas, I don't have a very different understanding. But that's not for me or to bring to the table at this very moment. Let me take it a different direction. There is no vetted, in place, active access on that property. And it'll be years but before that's developed, correct?
I think there's active discussions right now that I'm not prepared to.
Oh, that's okay. There are discussions. Fair enough. But there is no access at this time vetted, coastal development permit. We're years and years away from that being completed. Is that correct?
No, I don't know what the answer is to that question.
Okay, so we don't have the
variety of-
definition in the time, fair enough, but it certainly is not. So with my limited yet some knowledge of this process. This isn't going to be done until the next LCP, or at least the next update of the next LCP, which is in 5 years. I think that's a fair enough statement maybe to make. Just with the ESHA, with all of the process that everybody has to go through, the development permit hasn't been submitted. I mean, it's a lengthy process for some basic stuff. So what's the harm in getting that marker of proposed access marker off of that property?
So I think that with the sort of hatching option, that would include potentially an option that would also remove those specific.
Okay, fair enough.
We can bring forward multiple options. However, I will note that it was a $1.5 million deal that did include public access. $850,000 came from our taxpayer dollars through ag and open space. So that's everybody in the room, plus about another 500,000 residents, and 650,000 from the state coastal conservancy. And so, there is one of the things that has come up in conversations about this, as well as the Sonoma land hub property, is that there is a taxpayer investment in allowing members of the public to have access to these properties, and that therefore, because of the taxpayer investment of those dollars, it is okay to call it out on a map.
So I get that, except none of us, we don't care where the money comes from. if it's not a legally vetted, completely in place, public access, the difference does it make? And we hear this all the time in the proximity of the wildlands, that public money went to that. Well, that public money is completely irrelevant if you have to cross private property to get to it. So doesn't that piece, I hear you, I hear this frequently from the public. It's irrelevant at the end of the day if private property rights are being infringed. How much money did the county of Sonoma spend to date fighting with the Bordesses over this easement? Not what they paid to purchase it, but how much money went into fighting this issue with the lawsuit?
So
Great
the,
question, and how much money did the Bordesses spend of the 1.5 million that they received,
Yeah.
you know, from the county, which maybe they shouldn't have taken if they didn't really want to get into all of this.
So maybe if I could interject, so I guess the point I think that maybe you're trying to make is, and it goes along with everything else, until it is, why should it be on the map? And I think really that, we talked about trespassing earlier, this is just another element that adds another component to trespassing. So if we can limit it, because once it becomes public knowledge that that's been completed, which someday it will. I mean, the attorneys are fighting it out and whatever the result is, but at the time that it becomes a viable option to be a public access point, put a sign on it.
what if you put a text in it that said specifically, and took out the dot and said a text specifically for that property that is slated for public access pursuant to the
It's
agreement?
just something different than proposed, because proposed to me means, hey, this is happening, right? It's coming. Well, we know this one's happening too, right? And it might be 20 years before it gets done, or it might be 2 years, who the hell knows, right? We don't know, but if we can limit those things, some way to make it so that it's not public access. It's possible future, there's something.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think we need to be more clear and
Yeah.
more explicit so that it's not subject to interpretation and people can, you know,
It's clear.
interpret it with, you know, some reasonable, right? Like, we want to make it very, very crystal clear.
They're still gonna come looking anyway, but at least they're.
At least you'll be justified in saying, no, did you read this? You know, in large print, right on the map, it says this is not available.
I would also like to say, because Linda, you brought up the SLT parcel, and I would like to bring up, you cannot compare the SLT parcel and the Bordessa. The SLT parcel has no public access component to the purchase. It was specifically for ag and for resource protection. So that's what that was. The Bordessa is a whole different, that's a whole different story. So that's very different.
So I'm Chantia, the Birds with Sonoma Ranch Trust, and it's great to see Denny and Jen and Beth and all our neighbors at the Estero Americana Preserve. So actually the Estero Americana Preserve was divided in 2 phases. So we've owned and managed the lower parcels since 1997. And that's primarily actually with livestock grazing. And so ag is a big component of our land management. But the doer piece, the upper piece, did have language about providing for some limited community engagement. So I believe the language is promoting environmental education and limited public access. So it was a part of the vision of the State Coastal Conservancy and Sonoma Ag and Open Space when they provided us with funding to acquire these lands. And I believe that we fulfilled that. And so over the last 25 years, as I mentioned, livestock grazing is our primary land use out there, working to preserve and maintain the native coastal prairie. That is like, there's a high percentage of native perennial bunch grasses and wildflowers, and you guys have all seen it, but it's very concentrated on our preserve. And in terms of our activities, I did bring some things to share and tell you about. We have been partnering with lots and lots of different groups like Natural Resources Conservation Service and Goldbridge RCB, Sonoma State University in their intern program, and the Native Plant Society. And so we used to do a lot of vegetation monitoring, and interns put together a plant guide for our preserve. I have bird lists going back to 1982 from the Madrone Audubon Society, citizen scientists helping us to track the bird populations that are related to our management of the preserve. That mosaic of grassland managed through cattle is really important for raptors. I also have a booklet of drawings from 3rd graders who went out to the Estero Preserve and were blown away by the incredible beauty and wrote poetry about it. And it's the sweetest thing you'll ever look at. I have a report from CDFW looking at the health of the estuary and the eelgrass beds, because being able to access our preserve has helped enable other agencies to study the sensitive estuary habitat and then direct resources and more science, more engagement so that we can care for this very special place. So these are some of the activities that we've been having out there. It's very limited. We're not calling for an expansion of public use. We never want to have unescorted vehicles going down Estero Lane. We've never proposed that in the last 25 years, and we've been consistent over time, and that's what we want to retain in order to fulfill our conservation mission, to engage these very select audiences, like kids that need to get off of their phones, like systematically excluded populations and youth groups that need to be inspired for a career in the sciences. So these are some of the types of people that we invite onto our land. They're the best people you'd ever meet. And I think that this is what we're trying to do and maintain. And I think that this discussion about removing the dots is trying to shut down our programs. And I'm here to say that this is what makes Sonoma County what it is, when we have all these partners working together to care for this incredible landscape, using working lands as a model, livestock grazing, working with scientists to study the flora, birders to track the birds. It all comes together, and it's what makes this a beautiful place to live and recreate. It drives our economy. It's our sense of identity and way of life. And we're not trying to change any of that. We're trying to knit it together and make it better.
And in some response to that, I think we fully support every one of those things you just talked about. Not trying to stop it, not in any way. But the dot doesn't help you do that program. That dot doesn't benefit that program because you have invited guests, right? So the public doesn't need to see and know that. You can market to the public and share your program. You can do that. But you said it, it's guided, it's invited. And we don't need a dot on there inviting the people that aren't part of your program.
I have a question. Did you notice that we all saw during COVID that people were driving down any road that we could get down to get away from the cities and away from the people because our parks were closed. People were going in droves to the coast and trying to find any pullout so that they could just get a little piece of nature. And now that COVID is, that the parks have reopened and things are back, are you still seeing the amount of traffic and trespassing, or was that a blip? Like, I think that we need to share in a conversation more about how we can direct people to other places and less into these sensitive areas that we don't want vehicles going, down the one lane road with no pullouts. And
I agree with you, Sean.
yeah,
We're on the same page.
To address your direct question, Shante, there's been less, but I had to put some markers or cones out because people were ripping out up my little agricultural, access to your gate to get through the animals. Kids are pulling in there at night and partying. And that some of that stuff's always gonna happen, but your direct question was, have we seen that, abated? And no, we've not seen it. It is slightly reduced, but it's not abated.
I think it's increased, actually, just to let you know, because more people word of mouth have gotten out, and people posted their travels, and I see a lot more people that I catch trespassing, or maybe I'm just more observant to it, but. And then how do you feel when you have people that kayak and come up on your property and camp at night?
Yeah, so.
Or you don't know that because you're fenced off.
Yeah, so we have been subject to vandalism. Denny, you might remember somebody that bashed in our gate and stole our picnic table. So we're just as concerned about vandalism. And
I've seen people take your canoe, leave their dog on the property, go over to your property and like, no, before you hid your canoe, and it was out there, and I had a canoe there too, that was stolen. But they would use it,
But I think we're on the same page. I mean, we're with you.
Marker a different color and on the map say it's private and
We're not trying to stop the access to the land trust of the Wildlands Conservancy. We work well with with the wildlife conservancy.
The marker needs to be a different color.
The marker just doesn't need to be there.
Or
Not on that map.
So what I'm hearing, you know, and I feel like we're not in complete agreement, but, you know, that we do need more specificity for the dock. So there's a difference between sort of, you know, like future public access and limited public access, or managed public access, or sort of guest public access, right? And so that maybe there are ways to increase the clarity of the dots, to really more clearly delineate, you know, what is accessible now, what has limited public access, but does have public access as a critical component of who they are and of what taxpayers invested their dollars in.
So, and then from the staff perspective, one of the things that we could do if we had something like that, a very clear, different, undeveloped, or would be another one that we would want to make sure we see in certain places. Because just saying proposed, people might think it's already built out, and that's why they're really looking for it. It doesn't say that it's not even developed, that there's nothing there, right?
people like undeveloped.
Well, developed from a trails perspective, not developed. But one of the other things that we could do is if we had, you know, a little bit more specificity for these unique cases, with a dot still to help you show your work and what you're doing, but we could actually put a reference in the map to like a policy or a statement that would better describe your operation, so that if somebody is interested in that, they would actually know who to go to if they're interested in pursuing, you know, more information on that map. So we could partner on some language related to that, that we could, you know, have to make it really like that reference really clear, not open to the public, limited, however that works out. But then also direct people on where to go and how to actually see some of these more limited spaces,
Less is
as an
better.
additional option.
We don't need
I
it. Less is
personally,
better.
I personally like what Linda suggested earlier, which is just highlight body of water, because that is something that is public. That is the public. It would answer all our problems. I thought that was a good suggestion.
And I, sorry.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just bringing it back to sort of our goal here today is to kind of think about a relatively limited spectrum of options. And that certainly is going to be as one of the options. I just don't know that it's going to be the only option that comes out of today. So I just wanted to keep the conversation going in that sense.
But
as far as
an actual option. It's factual, and I like that.
It is also factual, right, that taxpayers have invested dollars in, you know, properties that do have a public use. And I mean, I'm almost like, what I wish we could put like a QR code on the map that takes you to, you know, your website, right? And shares about your tour, right? Like, we're not at that level because we're government, but I mean, if we could get to, you know, your website or, you know, manage tours, or actually even being able to share what it is that you do in a positive way that also directs people to, there's a waiting list. You need to, you know, you need to sign up on this email list so that you know when the wildflower walk is and all of those conversations. But I would really like to honor your mission, while also recognizing that we don't want to pretend there's a front gate by which anyone can go in, because there isn't, right? And that's sort of to the detriment of, you know, everyone when you have trespassing that somehow can be justified by someone pointing at something in a map, even though they're wrong, right?
So then people do read these maps. People, just the general public, do read these maps. It's part of what you're saying. And they absolutely do. Why should that be the focus on these maps? I would fully support Sonoma Land Trust having their own map catalog where they've got, you know, that's where we do our education, where we have limited public access. Why does any of this need to be on the LCP map that people absolutely read?
Because it was sort of a public investment, and so, you know, there is a sort of public stake in the property the same way that, you know, our roads and other, like, there's an interest of the public, and I think from a lot of the folks that I represent who maybe not at the meeting today, in knowing when and where they have opportunities to recreate along the coast.
So, but did the public purchase the right to trespass?
No one's saying that they did, so
Because it doesn't hold any water to say that public money went into those purchases for this application. It's not, it just doesn't matter. Because there are those of us that we're having our private properties infringed upon because of these markers.
So. It was bought with public money, but with limited access.
Correct. And so we can call that out on.
But why do we have to call that out? Because they're the steward. There, I'm not pointing. They're the steward of that property, and let them market it to who they want to market it to, and not have the LCP map market it.
Is the LCP a marketing department?
I don't think that matters, and I said marketing, but it doesn't need to be on the map, and I think we let Shanti and the land trust deal with that and take it away, because it's just another aggravation to trespassing. Shanti, your staff can't even find a property.
Yeah, I
mean, literally, I've caught twice where I've helped them guide them to your property. So even for land trust who has staff and has a property there, can't find it. The last time you found them, they were at Luke's Gate at the end of the lane, and then they came to our property at the top of Ranch 3, and they sat there, and then Danny went and found them and guided them down to the property. So you can see that for us, when I see somebody sitting at a gate, okay, who is it? What are they doing? So you drive up there, and now I don't know, just like a law officer, I don't know what I'm driving into, right? Dennis, I mean, I'm driving up there, these people are sitting there, holy cow, which is one of the reasons why we want to support everything you're doing and continue those activities, just like we do with wildlands, and we'd like to see that land privatized. Because there's no reason for anybody to go in there, and so long as you can continue to do everything that you've done in the past, and we honor that, and we do that for you too, the agreement that we have, there's really no reason for that road to be a public road. It should be privatized.
Okay.
Yet in this LCP, you guys have language in there that says if there's a proposed public access point, there's no way to privatize or vacate a right of way, which limits us on that.
Gotcha.
So we would like to help the county as far as saving tax dollars and maintaining a road that Linda, I don't know if you've driven up that road, that lane yet, but I would love to have you come up there. I'd love to meet you up there. And Shanti, you can speak to it. That road's a mess. I mean, it is, and there's no place to go. Once you pull off that asphalt, you're on my property. You're trespassing. It's period, because it said the county maintained road on asphalt. That's it. So to bring the public in there, and I mean, we're not sticklers about it, but when we see somebody that doesn't belong, we've had theft, we've had garbage dumping, house trailer come up there, no place to turn around, a semi truck going to the day to Harbor here. Up there that can't turn around, we damaged our gate, but we got them turned around.
For 3 hours, nobody could see.
Or Roy Garden, the two that has, well, they got the helicopter, they can get them, but anyway,
Gotcha.
you can see where we're at.
Yep, and I think we've got multiple more options to consider, and we've got some delicate interests to balance here. I think everyone can appreciate that. So I think we have our work cut out for us to further define these, respecting what everybody's ideas here today, and bring even more options to the board at this next meeting. I think it's complicated. I don't think we're going to come out with a 100% solution today.
But we know we have more options than we had before, which is good, right? I mean, there are a number of ideas that came out of this meeting that staff can go back and refine, and then we can bring before the board of supervisors. And I know it won't be this kind of a conversation, but at least you can send your emails, and make public comment regarding options A, B, C, however many we have on this particular policy. Sorry.
Well, we know like a little bit.
Before?
Yes.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why it's where we're advancing the hearing in July, so people have more time to consider what we offer up to the board in the report. But I did. So good ideas around emphasis on the water in the Estero generally. And then other good ideas around these very sensitive access points that have different levels of access in different venues, so, thank you.
Those maps having no public access written on the. this
So,
proposed
again, I don't think we're gonna get
documents.
100% there today,
No.
Yeah,
but we hear you.
But we are after no dots.
They hear that loud and clear.
Yeah.
Not that it won't be one of the options,
Yeah.
but
And I would love to come out and, walk with you sometime, particularly around how can we improve signage? With transportation and public works, and are there things that we can do, more proactively, to deter or, clarify that there is no public access on this road. So-
There's a sign there already that.
I know,
says
but
that.
more, I know
Bigger.
this, that is really truly, I don't wanna bring flashing lights to your neighborhood, but I'm saying, like sometimes certain visual changing things can help as well,
But we
so.
can talk.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful. I think, is it the first 250? I can't remember the first 5. I think it's first 250 feet of Estero Lane is undisputed public access. And at that point, at the mouth of Estero Lane on Highway 1, to have something that says, this is not a public road. 1977, the Coastal Commission deemed the entire road to be a private road. So once you get underneath the asphalt, it is completely private. So, if we could come up with something just for the first few hundred feet until we can settle the rest of this, that would be very helpful.
We can definitely get one of our, roads crews folks also to just come out and see what else is, we have struggled with similar issues and, one way in, one way out, no turnaround, areas in other parts of West County, and it feels like no matter how many times you tell people, there's still gonna be some person who, who does it, but we got to the point, right, of that bridge, what is it, the one down by the airport, Laughlin, right? We have like the vultures, right? There was, we do everything we possibly can. People will still ignore it, but it doesn't mean that we can't do better than what's out there. So, yeah, but anyways, thank you all so much for coming and dedicating so much of your time. And I really just appreciate the opportunity to have an actual conversation. Not a board meeting. So I look forward to seeing. We'll also send out an email newsletter, as soon as it's drafted up, so that you have that full 6 weeks to review it and provide your feedback. Yeah.